Behold, the final prince from the now-crumbled Briol kingdom, who desperately yearned for a release from his tragic fate. A shadowy entity then confronts his nearly lifeless form, mocking the sheer depth of his suffering. He was, after all, the one who orchestrated his own kingdom's downfall. A decade ago, he was an unparalleled master of chance, a gambling fiend who never lost. Utterly consumed by the intoxicating poison of his addiction, he arrogantly dismissed the pleas of his family's loyal mage to depart sooner. His rivals at the table dared to accuse him of cheating. This insult sent the young prince into a furious rage, overturning the entire table. But instead of grabbing a snack to fix his terrible mood, he chose to reveal his true, fearsome identity. He was none other than the third prince of the Briol kingdom. Without hesitation, he slaughtered the men who defied him. Later that evening, a fateful meeting occurred with Yekaterina Ivana Granzi, the very princess of the empire. She was furious with him for being late. His pathetic excuses only fueled the flames of her anger. Our boy royally angered her. In a terrible misunderstanding, she flung the precious necklace he had gifted her onto the cold ground. Yekaterina commanded him to never see her again. This left the prince to wonder how he could ever hope to earn her forgiveness. But a dark omen was brewing, unknown to either of them. A hidden spy had secretly witnessed their entire explosive argument. By the next day, that spy had already made a decisive, treacherous move. He twisted their words, shattering the fragile bond between the empire and the Briol kingdom. Their relationship began to crumble into nothing. The animosity between the two nations escalated, becoming more volatile than ever, until the day of judgment finally descended upon the Briol kingdom. In the chaos of a swift and sudden invasion, the kingdom's mighty gates were turned to ash before his very eyes. And with that, the brutal symphony of war had officially begun. This bloody war raged on for many soul-crushing years, a relentless, merciless conflict that claimed countless lives. During this time, the continent's most dreaded warrior, King Fiori Briol, vanished without a single trace. With the king's sudden disappearance from the battlefield, the tides of war shifted dramatically in the empire's favor. As the war escalated, Yuri began to suspect the empire, and more specifically, Princess Yekaterina. He believed she had betrayed him, leaking vital intelligence. The very instant his father departed the kingdom, the empire struck, unleashing the full might of its war machine. At first, Yuri desperately wanted to believe he was mistaken, that the princess couldn't possibly be the architect of the massacre that destroyed his entire family. But then, he tragically received a note of apology from her, and his heart plummeted deeper into an abyss of despair. The war raged on. He fought like a cornered animal for his life, cutting down countless enemies who stood in his path. Exhausted and trapped, even more imperial knights swarmed him. Yuri had finally surrendered to his fate and was ready for the end. But before the final blow could land, a loyal knight shielded him. He took the fatal strike, using his own body as a barrier. Lawrence's final act of loyalty was to ensure his prince could escape. Even as Yuri's heart screamed to save his loyal protector, he had to swallow his grief and flee for his life. Everything depended on the survival of his kingdom's heir. Days crawled by as the empire's hunters relentlessly pursued him. Yuri managed to find a temporary, squalid shelter, but it was terrifyingly clear that his time was running out. At this stage, absolute despair had completely consumed him. He fully resigned himself to the grim reality that his father had surely been assassinated. In that very moment, an imperial knight finally discovered his hiding place. But rather than extinguish the last flame of his noble lineage, he begged the man, pleading to live for the honor of his family. The knight, instead of delivering the killing blow, declared that the empire is fated to face the brutal consequences of its sins. He urged the last prince to flee as more soldiers were approaching. Once again, Yuri ran, desperately clinging to his own survival. He gambled on the slim hope of achieving vengeance one day. But in the cold, harsh end, everyone was gone. He understood with chilling certainty that it was all for nothing, and that one day, a knight would arrive to finally claim his life. This brings us back to his fateful encounter with the mysterious, shadowy figure who cruelly told Yuri he didn't deserve the peace of death. He placed the entire weight of blame for everyone's demise on it. Then, the dark figure revealed his true face, unmasking a horrifying, undead warrior seemingly from the depths of hell. This man was none other than Laurent, the very same knight who had died protecting him. And yet, he now stood here, ready to execute Yuri Briol, the man whose actions led to the utter ruin of his kingdom. His vengeful blade plunged directly into Yuri's heart. But what wounded him far more than the finality of death was the suffocating, soul-crushing guilt that Yuri carried. It dragged him down into an endless abyss of despair in his final moments. The last memory he grasped were the solemn words of his father, "Never abandon your honor," as his very consciousness dissolved into an endless black void. The next time he forced his eyes open, he was no longer in that world of ruin and death. Yuri Briol jolted awake in utter disbelief. Only this time, he was a mere child being reprimanded by his father, as the young boy had been unconscious for 3 entire days. His worried father had remained faithfully by his side, anxiously monitoring the young boy's perilous condition. Far too many impossible things were happening all at once. Yuri could not possibly process how his father was still alive, or even why he was present in this place to start with. Plunging back into despair, the boy wept and mourned, lamenting his father's demise right after his very own. However, the formidable leader of the Brioles had absolutely no clue what his son was saying. Yuri clutched his father's hand tightly and admitted that this was not such an unbelievable afterlife, because even though his father preached endlessly about honor, he too harbored plenty of his own dark and shadowy secrets. Finding his son's ravings to be more ridiculous than usual, he delivered a sharp smack to the kid's head, knocking some sense back into Yuri. The boy was instantly brought to tears by that heavy-handed blow, questioning why his father still couldn't manage his infuriating habit of hitting him, even in the afterlife. It appeared Yuri was entirely convinced they were both trapped in hell, until a single leaf drifted by the window, shocking him to his very core. His gaze was drawn to the breathtakingly beautiful view outside, and then a stunning realization struck him like lightning. This couldn't be hell, for it would never be adorned with such beauty, or filled with people who were so full of vibrant life. Because if this truly was hell, then legions of other damned sinners would be roaming the streets, and countless demons would surely be tormenting Yuri, mocking him for the pathetic existence he had led, the one responsible for the catastrophic demise of his own kingdom. Slowly, the impossible reality started to set in, as he looked upon his father and the rest of his brothers, all alive. Suddenly, the young boy's vision began to blur, and he collapsed once more, prompting his entire family to cry out his name in alarm. The unbelievable truth is that in this moment, the third prince of the once mighty Briol kingdom had traveled through time, regressing to his 13-year-old self. Let us now delve into the chaos of his own thoughts for a moment. All this time, Yuri had believed this was all some vivid, twisted dream, or perhaps a powerful sense of déjà vu striking him at the moment of his death. But despite his desperate and frantic attempts, he was completely unable to awaken from this bizarre dream. Furthermore, the world as he had known it had not ended in flames. Life was proceeding on its normal, peaceful course, and the memories he once believed long forgotten were now resurfacing. In this new present, he shares an ordinary family meal, and finally comes to terms with the incredible outcome of his fate. He has truly returned to his own past, to the very same spring when he first turned 13 years old. A second chance, a divine opportunity to rewrite everything. The following morning, one of the maids enters to assist the young master, to rouse him from his deep and peaceful slumber. Yuri had specifically instructed her to wake him up promptly, and yet he continues to sleep as if he were dead to the world. The boy jolts awake in a state of panic and shock, realizing with horror that he's late for his swordsmanship training. He frantically rushes through all of his morning preparations, begging his maid, Ina, to ready everything while he quickly washes up. He's in such a frantic state of panic that even Ina, the maid, believes he needs to seriously calm down a little. She gently suggests they proceed more slowly, helping him wash his face first. By the way, seeing her alive and well once more triggers a flood of incredibly traumatic memories in his mind, because in his original grim timeline, he discovered Ina's lifeless body, slaughtered among the others. The hauntingly vivid memory of her death still fills him with rage, turning to face her directly with grim determination. Yuri makes an absolutely unbelievable and shocking request. He demands his own loyal maid to slap him across the face. Ina is completely and utterly speechless. Her sworn duty is to serve him and ensure his well-being, and to strike him would be a complete betrayal of her sacred role. It is considered a grave offense for any servant, but Yuri insists arguing that it's a direct order from him, so it should be perfectly acceptable. The maid is still deeply worried and asks if he is absolutely certain about this command. The self-assured Yuri is just in the middle of finishing his sentence when a thunderous smack echoes across his stunned face, so deafeningly loud that it even startles the birds outside the window. Just imagine the sheer comedy if she had killed him by mistake. This entire epic story would have ended right then and there. The scene cuts to the training grounds, and indeed, Yuri's cheek is now swollen up like a massive balloon. He had completely forgotten just how deceptively strong Ina truly was, as he awkwardly practices with his practice blade. Even the onlookers are openly laughing at his pitiful condition, instead of offering some kind of healing ointment for the swelling. Our boy has the entire group of knights laughing at him instead. The most hilarious part is that Bernard, his own personal sword instructor, doesn't even bother to acknowledge his face looking different today. The boy interestingly observes that his teacher doesn't even critique Yuri's flawed and clumsy stance or his poor positioning. He merely provides the boy with sparring practice without offering any actual constructive feedback. It makes Yuri seriously begin to wonder how this man ever managed to become a teacher in the first place. The third prince then recalls a meeting he secretly spied on between Bernard and his own father. The sword instructor had complained at length about Yuri's squandered potential. The boy could achieve so much with his natural talent, but he shows absolutely no seriousness in his training. If he only tried, he has the fundamental skills to become the most legendary warrior in their entire kingdom. It turns out that Bernard is actually an incredibly skilled teacher. It was genuinely just Yuri being a truly terrible student that had forced him into this frustrating position. In his previous tragic life, the young boy paid no mind to the meeting and simply became even lazier. This realization deeply frustrates the current version of him, because now he fully understands the grave mistakes he made in his youth. So this time, Yuri confronts his teacher and declares that from this day forward, he will finally learn the way of the sword properly. He is now officially prepared to give his 100% in every single session. The legendary sword teacher grins widely, wondering what has suddenly ignited this fire within the boy. But he is genuinely thrilled to hear those determined words, unleashing a terrifying wave of crackling blue aura. Bernard declares the beginning of the child's true hellish training. With that said, he vanishes, moving at an incredible speed, and clashes his blade ferociously against the young masters. Realizing that he wasn't perfectly clear with his earlier declaration, Yuri hastily tries to stop the man from ending his second life prematurely. Bernard returns to his original position, while our poor boy is left with a look of pure horror on his face. He was so caught up in his own determination earlier that he had completely forgotten something of critical importance. The man radiating a fearsome blue aura and walking toward him was once feared across the lands as the sword demon before he ever began his service to the king. And well, that fact nearly makes Yuri wet his pants, and you can see the absolute terror pooling on his young face. After a grueling and truly excruciating training session, the kid collapses onto the ground in utter defeat and exhaustion. He had just received a small taste of what a real training session with the sword demon actually looked like. The one and only reason he was even able to fight against his teacher was due to his hard-earned experience as a blade for hire from his original tragic timeline. Despite the immense struggle for his very life, Yuri discovers a newfound optimism within his training. Sure, it made him want to end his own life again, but at least he was improving at an incredible rate along the way. The true shocker, however, is Bernard's own astonished reaction. He cannot believe that the young prince was somehow able to block every single one of his attacks. His rate of growth became almost supernatural in the midst of their duel, suddenly interrupting their intense session. Ina throws the doors open with a loud bang, panting heavily and urgently requesting the young master to come with her. Both Yuri and Bernard are deeply alarmed to learn that the king himself is summoning his son. When our boy demands to know what's causing such immense urgency, he discovers that it is because the infamous Count Johannes has brought his own son to pay them a formal visit. And by the way, Count Johannes' son is the exact same treacherous bastard who was responsible for betraying the entire kingdom of Briol and opening the gates for the Empire's devastating attack. Got Barkvar is nothing but a traitorous, cowardly slimeball, and now he has returned to haunt him once again. Addressing his maid, Yuri's voice becomes laced with cold, hard determination as he demands to know the current location of that scumbag. In the following scene, the royal family is sharing a meal with their esteemed guests, observing the newly poised demeanor of the third prince. Count Johannes appears to be genuinely taken aback. He even goes so far as to compliment the young boy's physique. The king proudly confirms this observation, and even speculates that perhaps Yuri is eating something new in his diet. Count Johannes jokingly suggests in response that they should share whatever he's eating with Gott, his very own son. The king returns the compliment and commends young Gott's sharp intelligence. But it seems his own father does not share that same opinion and argues that his son is unfortunately lacking in many areas. Speaking of the devil, Gott seems to be completely captivated by Yuri's brother, practically fangirling over him. As for our hero, he is busy glaring daggers at the traitor. This causes Gott to nervously look away in submission. Yuri's other brother senses this strange atmosphere and begins to wonder if something has occurred between the two, noticing the palpable, conflicting tension between them. The most amusing part is how our boy casually admits that this kid literally stabbed him in the back. Upon hearing this, his brother mockingly taunts Yuri for letting someone like that go unpunished, especially after they betrayed him to such a catastrophic degree. He is not wrong in his assessment, by the way. It seems Yuri has a burning, vengeful hatred for God. He points out how the kid only pretends to be of high nobility, when in reality, he is nothing more than a coward. The fierce expression on his face has not changed at all. Growing enraged, God furiously shoots him a venomous glare, returning that exact same hostile energy, but instead of allowing the situation to escalate further. Our hero decides to maintain his composure and remain calm, remembering that he must handle this situation with intelligence. After all, there is absolutely no way in hell that he will allow this bastard to destroy the kingdom of Briol once again, or repeat the devastating mistakes from his past life. Speaking of his past, Yuri also recalls having fought him around this exact same time. In his original life, though, it was just a simple argument. It may well have been the very trigger that led Gott to betray the kingdom. Sometime later in the next scene, they enter the training arena where Yuri tosses him a wooden practice sword. Acknowledging Gott's renowned skills with the blade, the young man humbly downplays his own capabilities until our hero sternly reminds him that their proud kingdom is not known for producing cowardly and weak-willed knights. God has no idea where this is coming from, as he's far from ever becoming an actual knight at this point. Yuri bluntly informs him that it is his destiny to become one someday, so he cannot deny the future that awaits him. While the pipsqueak is in the middle of countering his words, Yuri launches himself forward at full, terrifying speed, signaling the official start of their duel. Wielding the most legendary and powerful weapon in the entire universe, the almighty stick, he clashes his weapon against Gott's, who immediately calls him a coward for launching a surprise attack. Suddenly, our hero reveals he is not done yet. He displays his incredible battle IQ by kicking a cloud of dirt directly into his opponent's face, temporarily blinding God and creating a crucial opening. The arrogant kid is now finished being toyed around with. He reminds Yuri of the honorable code of combat that knights must uphold. But to his utter shock, our boy literally tosses his sword to the ground, which is a clear and simple way of saying, I don't even need a weapon to completely destroy you. My bare hands are more than enough for this job. Propelling himself forward with a confident, powerful stride, Yuri kicks the ever-living daylights out of the poor kid and sends him sprawling to the ground. And here I thought you couldn't bitch slap someone with a kick. Holding his wooden infinity stick of ultimate destruction in his hand, he declares his complete and total victory over Gott Barkvar, reflecting on how this same pathetic child became a vile traitor who sold his family's honor to further the Empire's wicked cause. He bluntly tells Gott that his father is a truly amazing man, a highly respected knight throughout the entire kingdom. A prestigious position like that exists for a very good reason, and that very same position may one day pass down to the young boy, offering him a hand to stand. Yuri reflects that everyone possesses the instinct to survive in life, but he simply cannot tolerate it when one of his kingdom's own knights is as weak-willed as God. This time, in this new life, he absolutely refuses to create such a weakling, and that includes himself. He then repeats his question, demanding to know why his father became a count in the first place. He doesn't expect God to provide an answer right away. He just wants the boy to reflect deeply on this very same question. Every single time, he finds himself in a difficult situation. The tense situation resolves itself as God departs on a positive note. As for Yuri's older brother, He's completely and utterly shocked that he actually won that battle, openly admitting that he was personally rooting for God to win. This seems cruel at first glance, but remember, at this particular point in time, Yuri is widely known as a reckless and lazy young master anyway. The kid takes offense to this, but his brother quickly reminds him that everyone knows the third prince is famous for being a troublemaker and a compulsive gambler, so it's not a particularly unfair assessment. Annoyed, Yuri boldly declares that he is changing his ways for good and warns his brother to stop pretending and teasing him about it. Seeing the completely surprised Pikachu face on his brother, Yuri can't help but smile teasingly as his sibling fails to figure out what the hell has gotten into him. Several days passed in a blur. The hellish training regimen between him and Bernard raged on relentlessly. By the evening, our boy is completely and utterly exhausted. With his sword training now well underway, the instructor makes a new recommendation, that they begin teaching him a powerful mana manipulation method. Yuri's eyes light up with excitement, and he questions if he's about to learn Bernard's own personal mana technique. But his teacher quickly crushes his hopes by stating otherwise, believing that he is nowhere near ready for something of that caliber. Instead, he firmly believes that Yuri Bryal should first learn the official, time-honored Bryal method. The kid doesn't understand why, but Bernard vouches for this mana method, praising it for being a perfectly balanced and efficient one. Now here's the critical issue. Our boy has already completely mastered the Bryal method in his previous life, so he won't be making any significant gains by learning it all over again. Not to mention, he had already reached its absolute limits during his time as a mercenary. Noticing his student's frustrated reaction, the sword instructor begins to wonder if the third prince had something else entirely in his mind. The kid thinks for a moment and finally reaches his decision. He wants the instructor to recommend a truly competent instructor from the esteemed royal guard to teach him. It's perfectly fine if this person isn't incredibly skilled. All they need to be is a reservoir of exceptional raw talent so that he can learn directly from them. After all, despite all his experience as a hardened mercenary, there is one specific technique that Yuri could never manage to get his hands on in his previous life. With the keyword potential in his mind, the reputable instructor enters a deep state of contemplation. At last, he comes up with the perfect answer. It has to be Jared, the one who possesses the most potential of them all. The name Jared once again triggers a flood of memories for the boy. He had encountered the man in the hellish war of his previous life. At that point in time, he didn't stand out as an exceptional person at all. In fact, you could even describe him as pathetic. So much so that it was a miracle he had even survived the war. He had complained to Yuri about his pitiful state back then. Even our boy believes that Jared must have possessed some truly monstrous natural talent. But reality is a cruel mistress because of his own careless negligence. He failed to properly train or hone his incredible abilities, and so he could never become truly powerful. By the time the war arrived, he was just a sobbing, useless mess, and it was ironically Yuri who ended up giving him hope. They had both been a terrible waste of talent. By the time the war hit them both like a speeding truck, and yes, by truck, I do mean the legendary truck coin, returning to the present day. Our hero is filled with optimism and decides to meet Jared personally, dubbing him his new potential knight. Speaking of the man, he is currently in the middle of training right now, and Yuri is hoping to flip a light switch inside of him to make certain he doesn't end up disappointing himself again. So, in the next scene, he heads directly to the Royal Guard Training Academy to meet up with the man himself, Jared. Seeing the young master's sudden arrival, a senior knight questions what has brought him to this place. The kid coolly states that he came to check up on them and to learn if the knights are working hard enough every day. Our boy takes a look around for himself and spots the trainees fiercely engaged in intense combat, facing off against each other with incredible ferocity. But out of all of them, he specifically asks for Jared, who does not appear to be present among the fighters, abiding by his royal request. The senior knight points to the rookie's current location. Just seeing him in such a pathetic state, our boy lets out a long sigh of pure annoyance. He finally understands why Bernard reacted the way he did earlier. From the looks of it, Jared's training is actually quite pathetic when compared to all the other fighters. Normally, you are expected to go above and beyond in your training routine. But this man is basically just doing the bare minimum requirements without making any significant use of his immense skills. Seeing him like this, it comes as no surprise at all that he ends up as a rusty, useless knight in the dark future. Yuri tasks the senior knight Sir Rasso to provide him with a wooden sword, as he is interested in joining them for a sparring session. Rasso is quite pleased and immediately asks, which opponent the third prince will be choosing for his sparring session. As you all have probably already guessed by now, Yuri points directly at the slacker and requests a match with him. After some time, a hush falls over the entire arena. The other trainees are now resting, while Jared faces off against his opponent, the young master of the Brile Kingdom himself. His fellow trainees are all cheering him on enthusiastically, hoping that Jared will perform at his absolute best, even though the man himself is looking incredibly annoyed, like he doesn't even want to be here at all. The boy directly addresses his chosen opponent, claiming that he had heard of his great potential as a knight. That is precisely why he has personally come here, to test the true limits of those rumored abilities. Yuri wants to witness Jared's future with his own eyes. Feeling nervous, the trainee accepts the duel's stated purpose. Going on the offensive, the fight kicks off as our boy lunges forward, in the hopes of being genuinely impressed. Jared simply waits, not showing a single hint of fear or concern. From where he stands, he calmly deflects our boy's swing with his own, even though the young master is the one on the offensive. His opponent's movements are perfectly calculated with every step, so much so that Jared's peers are completely amazed by his skill. As the fierce fight continues, the trainees begin to notice how the third prince is also performing exceptionally well for his young age and supposed experience. But something about the fight itself has the slacker questioning just what is going on. Yuri strikes him once again, forcing the man to block the blow. He senses that the strange consistency of Yuri's attacks isn't just for show. This is all completely deliberate. It is actually an effort to match their fighting pace equally. Quickly, the battle becomes rather dull and uninteresting, because so far, Yuri hasn't actually done anything significant, but react accordingly to the energy he is receiving from the knight, deciding to go all out and actually seize control of the battle. Our boy hammers down his sword with so much overwhelming force that it momentarily knocks the wind out of Jared. But that is not all. The fact that the rookie knight was still able to deflect the attack just proves the immense level of talent he truly possesses. Yuri admits to himself that his opponent's reflexes are out of this world, but he is not finished yet, as he pushes Jared back with a wide swing. The fight is beginning to wear him down and push him back. Yuri's attacks are now completely different than they were before. All of a sudden, Jared finally stops, taking it easy on the young master, and fiercely retaliates with each and every strike. Yuri, now forced onto the defensive, concludes that this was how it was always going to be, despite possessing all the experience from his past life. It doesn't change the fact that Jared is an incredibly powerful knight. Victory was always completely out of the question for him. And yet, at the same time, our boy has one final trick up his sleeve. Surprising his opponent, Yuri swings his blade in a powerful upward strike, forcing Jared's blade to suffer such a violent recoil that it creates a perfect, decisive opening. With a confident smirk on his face, the third prince admits that he's going to land a solid hit, even if it means he is destined to lose this fight. And so, that is exactly what he does. Blazing forward with a lightning-fast, slicing motion, he cuts past the knight, landing a confirmed, clean hit, celebrating his impressive strike. Even the rest of the trainees are at a complete loss for words. The third prince's absolutely excellent technique managed to land a clean hit against the formidable Jared, and they all erupted in praise for his incredible feat. But the fight is not over, as the young master readies his blade again, questioning if Jared is still attempting to hold back his power, instead of being arrogant about it. The knight internalizes his growing confusion, even though he should have had control of the fight. With every move he makes, it feels like he's the one being driven back, striding forth with renewed determination. A now passionate Jared nearly gets struck once again. The third prince goads him, encouraging him to try harder, which in turn causes the talented knight to grow increasingly annoyed. In his growing anger, he coats his weapon with a powerful mana technique. His sudden use of this dangerous ability has Sir Rasso and the others shouting at him in alarm for invoking such a forbidden ability against the young master. But this man doesn't care about the rules anymore, as his blade pulses with a terrifying blue aura, and it slices just past the third prince's neck. If Yuri had not been extremely careful just then, he truly would have been struck down badly. Jared's rage-filled state turns to one of pure despair. That last terrifying attack, just now, it chopped away a few strands of hair from the young master's head, and even left a small, bleeding scratch. The realization hits him hard. Jared is immediately scolded for being a lunatic who attacked the young master, while Raso is fearful and anxiously checks on Yuri's condition. Instead of making a huge deal out of what just happened, our boy believes it's just an inevitable outcome in a serious spar. He bandages his minor, bleeding scratch shut, and commands the knight to pick up his weapon once again, as their epic fight has only just begun. Lunging back into motion, Yuri goes on the offensive yet again. Their blades clash ferociously as the third prince finds himself amused, swiftly overwhelming his opponent with each and every strike. Of this fact, the rookie knight now saw the stark contrast between himself and the prince. One had been coasting through training with minimal exertion, while the other fought with a burning desire to prove his true worth. Beyond that, Yuri was clearly relishing this challenge, not feeling cornered at all, as he met Jared's relentless onslaught blow for furious blow. It wasn't merely that the young master was giving his all. He was strategically pushing himself to even greater heights with each attack. Their clash locked them in a fierce stalemate, but Jared found his own composure beginning to shatter. He was consumed by an unfamiliar rage. This raw passion and burning fury had never awakened in him before, not even when battling far more powerful adversaries. Meanwhile, our hero looked absolutely magnificent with his piercing blue eyes, as he expertly parried Jared's determined advance. The knight could not fathom that the young prince was pushing him to such extraordinary limits. Speaking of which, Yuri surged forward, unleashing another sweeping horizontal strike. His opponent narrowly evaded it. But it's clear that Yuri had exacted his revenge for the haircut, as he neatly sliced off a few strands from Jared's own hair. The knight gripped his blade with immense power, channeling his fury as he swung it down upon the prince. I believe he's invoking a mana technique himself here, because his weapon literally cracks and shatters Yuri's wooden sword. The epic duel reached its conclusion with a decisive victory. Instead of feeling defeated by this outcome, our hero maintained his composure and smiled at his opponent. Jared's powerful aura faded as his body heaved with exhaustion, the consequence of unleashing so much of his power. The young prince graciously offered a hand to the weary knight, stating that he had learned a great deal in their battle. Jared, though slightly flustered, praised the prince for his efforts as well. As they clasped hands, the knight realized his opponent's indomitable fighting spirit and sheer drive were unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. Within the body of this young prince resided a truly powerful warrior. While he was lost deep within these thoughts, he completely forgot he was still holding on to Yuri's hand. The boy sharply confronted him and demanded, why on earth the knight was acting so surprisingly calm? After all, he was the one who had left an injury on the prince's head. Scampering away with his tail tucked between his legs, Jared quickly vanished from sight anyway. That monumental clash had taken a heavy toll on our hero as well. The moment it was over, he collapsed onto the ground, every fiber of his being completely spent. The surrounding knights erupted in cheers for Yuri's incredible display. Amidst their boisterous celebration, the formidable captain of the knights, who bore a slight resemblance to Bernard, made his timely appearance and spotted the young prince resting in the aftermath of the intense battle. Saint is the esteemed captain of the Royal Guard of Brio, and he has just developed a keen interest in the young boy. The scene transitions to a few days after the momentous incident. Jared is seen heading home after finishing his shift, when a familiar voice suddenly stops to intercept him. It is none other than the third prince, casually awaiting his arrival. Yuri instructs the man to accompany him, as they have an important destination to reach. Instead of obeying him without question, Jared expresses concern about his own training, which he would be forced to miss if he were to tag along. This is actually a rather significant change in him, as noted by Yuri himself, because it proves that Jared now holds his abilities in high regard. At the same time, the third prince confesses that he is the one who arranged this, so for this occasion only, Jared must accompany him. The knight dutifully accepts the command. It's not as if he could defy the young prince in any case. Meanwhile, our hero is pleased with the man's current mindset. There is still a great deal for them to work on, but this is a promising start. Curious, the knight inquires about where they are headed, to which Yuri tells him to just remain silent and continue following. Jared worries that the young prince might be stirring up trouble again, but our boy reassures him that nothing of the sort will occur, as they're not embarking on this small journey alone. The knight asks about their other companions, while Yuri shouts out to the man, just up ahead. It is actually the court mage of their own family, Hernando, who is startled by the young master's sudden summons. The kid immediately states that he needs to go somewhere and requires the mage's personal assistance. Hernando is not about to fall for a request like that and quickly tries to refuse until our protagonist strikes him where he is weakest, revealing that the mage has a mountain of crushing gambling debt that could be instantly wiped clean. Flabbergasted, the mage turns around to confirm the young master's words. The prince assures the man that he will pay off every single coin, and it's not as if he is attempting to scam him either, as Yuri is known for never lying outside of the gambling dens. Seeing Hernando vouch for our hero's supposed honesty, Yuri gets excited until reality comes crashing down on him when Hernando clarifies that all he has ever seen him do is lie within the gambling dens, so it does not exactly paint a very good impression of him. Still, Yuri guarantees he will pay the debt, so the mage must now accompany him. Deciding to finally acquiesce to the request, Hernando produces an entire legally binding contract for him to sign to ensure he is not being swindled by the boy. Yuri's face falls in utter devastation as our hero realizes that not even his title as the third prince holds much weight in this damn, unforgiving world. Amusingly, he places all the liability under Jared's name, commanding the knight to follow his orders precisely. At first, it appears that poor Jared is being thrown under the bus, but in actual fact, this is Yuri's clever way of avoiding the contract entirely. He wants the knight to serve as a key witness to their purely verbal agreement. With that matter finally settled, Hernando is ready to depart, but he is still completely unsure where on earth they are going. After all, if the young prince is taking a knight and a mage to such great lengths, then the matter at hand must be incredibly urgent. At long last, Yuri unveils his true mission. They will be journeying to the legendary sword mount. The mage fails to grasp the ultimate objective until the young prince flashes a grin and proclaims they're going to claim the lost legacy of his ancestor as they venture through the forgotten derelict passage, with Jared taking the lead in front. Hernando remarks that he never would have imagined a secret pathway like this even existed, hidden right beneath the Grand Royal Palace. Jared turns and asks Yuri what awaits them at the end of this lengthy, dark cave, and the prince shrugs as if it's no major concern, casually stating that it leads directly to Sword Mountain, which absolutely stuns the knight, who asks if it is that legendary peak from all the ancient stories. Pausing for a dramatic moment, Yuri nods and confirms it is that very one. He then drifts off into a deep recollection as he remembers how his past life descended into madness when the founder's great legacy was finally discovered, right after the Empire had taken control of Brial, while fleeing amidst all of that chaos. He recalled reading a newspaper article stating that a hidden dungeon had been unearthed inside Sword Mountain. Conversely, he had only used this tunnel to make a hasty escape, and the so-called glorious legacy slipped right into the greedy, filthy hands of the Empire. But unlike his past self, who only cared about his own survival, this time, our hero is aiming directly for the truth and refuses to turn back. He focuses his resolve and decides he must witness firsthand what manner of legacy his great ancestors had truly left behind. A moment later, the scene reveals a lush, verdant forest, one that looks like it was torn straight from a fantasy epic, and Yuri forces open the enormous, rust-covered doors at the tunnel's end. The squad steps out into the vast, open woods as Hernando surveys the surrounding area and asks if Sword Mountain truly begins from this point. He then abruptly changes the subject and asks how Yuri acquired the key, while the prince silently remembers that, just like in his previous life, it had been sitting in his study this entire time. However, he was ignorant of its immense value back then, a mistake which cost him dearly. But he simply orders the mage to stop acting like a prying old woman and to forget about the entire matter. Right on cue, he suddenly cries out in pain as a sharp thorn pierces his palm, and Yuri warns him that the leaves here are essentially razor blades, so he had better behave and just follow along like a good little boy. As they forge deeper into the treacherous forest, Hernando sidles up next to Jared, and whispers if perhaps the prince had suffered a head injury, since he's been acting so bizarrely as of late. A sentiment with which the knight happens to completely agree. But before either of them can continue their gossip, Yuri yells from up ahead, telling the two slackers to get a move on, which proves that he still retains that same old imperious streak. Yuri's senses sharpen as he notices something moving in the distance, and suddenly signals for the duo to halt immediately in their tracks and to remain absolutely silent. He points out a large pack of direwolves just ahead, who appear to be one wrong move away from dinner time. He whispers that they are pack hunters, so more are likely nearby, and Jared is clearly astonished that the so-called failure of a prince actually possesses some useful knowledge. Yuri calmly explains that he learned it from a book, and Hernando nearly faints at the very mental image of Yuri, even voluntarily touching a book. Yuri adds that the wolves have not detected them yet, so the plan is to sneak past them without making a sound. But fate, it seems, has other plans in store, because Hernando takes a step back and manages to step on the single, solitary twig in the entire forest, which emits a loud crack that nearly gives everyone a heart attack. Attempting to play it off coolly, he offers a nervous apology while sweating profusely, only for a massive direwolf to leap from above to try and make him lunch. Jared panics and surges forward, yelling the mage's name in alarm, and swings his sword powerfully enough to cleanly sever the wolf's head. In a single, brutal motion, the beast thuds down beside Hernando, and Yuri commends Jared for utilizing his mana, since dire wolf hide is as tough as iron plate armor. Unfortunately, that flashy maneuver comes at a steep price, as the pack's alpha, who is clearly much larger than the rest, locks its eyes onto Jared. The colossal beast lets out a blood-curdling howl, and in mere seconds, the squad finds itself completely surrounded by the entire wolf pack. While Jared tightens his white-knuckled grip on his sword, he tells the other two to stay close as he channels his mana once more, and the hungry wolves begin to drool, as if they have just discovered an all-you-can-eat buffet. They all lunge forward in a coordinated attack, but Jared is not about to let that happen. He glares at them with eyes full of deadly intent, and carves a path right through the pack without breaking his stride. Meanwhile, Hernando praises the knight's swordsmanship, and even Yuri concurs, though he silently thinks to himself that Jared still has a long way to go. While watching him valiantly hold his ground, Jared begins to struggle as the wolves continue their relentless assault, and Yuri finally prods Hernando to stop just standing there, and to show off those impressive skills his proud father constantly boasts about. That finally gets Hernando moving, and he cracks a joke, saying the prince is seriously overworking his personal battle mage, while conjuring at least 100 blazing fireballs. Jared glances back mid-combat, and asks what that's supposed to mean, but his focus immediately snaps back to the fight, as he spots a fireball hurtling directly towards him. He barely manages to leap out of the way in time, and falls back, just as the powerful spell detonates, and completely vaporizes the wolves in one massive, fiery explosion that reduces the battlefield to nothing but scorched earth. A few brutally grueling hours later, and after carving their way through all manner of terrifying monsters, the squad finally arrives at the mountain's majestic peak. Jared is panting heavily as he tries to regain his breath, and is clearly exasperated by the non-stop, endless combat. The trio stands near the cliff's edge, taking in the breathtaking view, and Jared looks around the completely barren stretch of land, asking if this is even the correct location. But our hero is already completely focused, and states with absolute confidence that he knows it is. He then begins to prod around the immediate area. Peeking behind a large, imposing rock, he finally sees something gleaming, half buried in the ground, and his eyes widen with the excitement of a child on Christmas morning. Yuri does not waste a single second and begins to unearth it, while Jared rushes over to stop him, saying that a prince should not be performing such grunt work. He summons Hernando over to assist as well, but the pampered mage acts utterly horrified and claims that touching the dirt is far beneath his noble rank, and calls it a complete disgrace for a powerful mage. A short while later, they succeed in pulling the object out, and Yuri lifts the magnificent sword from the earth, staring at the lustrous, expensive-looking blade with a genuine sparkle in his eyes. Hernando adopts his best detective stance and observes that it doesn't even appear to be that old, perhaps as if it was only placed here quite recently. Yuri squints his eyes and notices something at the base of the blade. The single word guilty has been carved into the metal. Jared approaches and asks if this is the ancestor's fabled legacy. But Yuri remains uncertain as he continues to inspect the mysterious sword. Suddenly, the very ground begins to tremble violently beneath their feet, which puts everyone on high alert as Yuri smirks and says, "This is the perfect chance to discover the truth." The earth fractures and splits wide open beneath them, and Jared lets out a scream worthy of a drama queen as they all plummet down into the gaping abyss. The royal knight continues to scream his lungs out until he finally slams hard onto the ground, landing in front of a very ominous-looking pathway. Yuri immediately jolts awake as he discovers he is lying directly on top of the knight, who had clearly shielded him during the fall, and begins to get off, while Jared groans and complains about the intense pain like an old man. Yuri quickly deduces that he used mana to reinforce his entire body, and calls the feat quite impressive, though the knight promptly blacks out on the spot from pure, raw exhaustion. Moments later, Hernando floats down as if he's Mary Poppins on a holiday, and remarks that this place is far deeper than he had anticipated. Yuri shoots him a death glare and mutters under his breath that the mage completely disregarded the prince's own safety, and instead prioritized saving his own miserable life, a fact which Hernando nervously tries to obscure with some feeble excuses. But before he can enter his full-on lawyer mode, an abrupt noise causes the battle mage to spin around quickly as he spots something deeply cursed creeping towards them through the tunnel, and tries to warn Yuri, who still believes he's just deflecting blame. Hernando continues to insist that he is being completely serious, and then screams that it is a genuine ghost, which finally flips Yuri's switch as he whips around in a panic. Sure enough, an imposing, armored figure that looks as if it crawled straight out of a horror story is slowly making its way towards them, radiating a serious aura of death. And Yuri immediately identifies it as a powerful death knight, while locking his piercing eyes with it. He commands Jared to get back on his feet immediately, though the man still appears to be halfway to dreamland, and merely groans like a zombie in response. But a swift kick to his side awakens his very soul, and he bolts upright in a panic. Jared gasps the moment he lays eyes on the approaching horror, and dramatically positions himself in front of the prince, yelling that he will personally handle the Death Knight. Though Yuri doesn't appear to be particularly impressed by his bravado, the Death Knight grinds to a complete halt directly in front of them, while Yuri narrows his intense gaze and recalls that these beings were once ordinary knights before they were horrifyingly resurrected, far stronger than they ever were in life. Still, he observes that this one does not seem hostile and decides to approach it calmly. Jared clearly questions the logic behind that particular move, but Yuri replies with confidence that he just knows these kinds of things, and explains that it would be illogical for the Founders' own personal guards to attack their own bloodline. Locking eyes with the Ancient Knight, he declares his name loudly and clearly. The Death Knight processes this small act of sheer audacity by standing there like a loading screen for a brief second before suddenly drawing its powerful sword, which instantly throws the other two into a state of panic. But it is already far too late, as the Death Knight swings its massive sword at the prince, who is too stunned to even so much as flinch, though instead of dicing him into small pieces, the blade stabs deep into the ground. After giving him a very close emergency haircut, Hernando plummets into despair mode and dramatically cries that the prince just contracted sudden head loss syndrome. But Yuri tells him to be quiet, but the mage mourns the surprise haircut instead. The ancient skeleton finally opens its mouth and says that Yuri possesses the same arrogant energy as the last one. After sheathing his great sword, Yuri asks who this mysterious figure even is, and the Death Knight reveals his identity as Eric Bryall, a revelation which causes everyone's jaws to drop. Jared echoes the legendary name in pure disbelief, while Hernando goes into full history nerd mode and explains that he is the one and only Gigachat that no one in Bryall could ever possibly forget, the very man who single-handedly conquered the entire continent. He is also the revered founder of the Bryall Kingdom and served as its very first king. Yuri stands up straighter and asks if he is the very first person to ever reach this place, and the Death Knight confirms that he is, adding that only a true descendant of Bryall could ever draw that blade. In any case, This confirms Yuri's suspicions for good, that the sword truly is the treasured heirloom wielded by his ancestors, and he brings it closer to his face for a detailed inspection. The Death Knight nonchalantly mentions that he used it previously, which instantly ruins Yuri's vibe and leaves him feeling mildly irritated, a reaction which seems to confuse the Death Knight. However, our hero simply apologizes for taking his belongings. The ancient skeleton then drops his formal, official tone and asks Yuri to speak with honesty about why he has come here. Yuri tightens his resolute grip on the blade as he declares his full, noble name. The Death Knight stares at him for a long moment before turning towards a large, glowing crystal and dramatically announces that the time has come to fulfill his sacred duty. He adds that he shall grant Yuri that which he came for, and the prince begins to sweat slightly as he starts to follow behind. Meanwhile, Jared appears to be completely zoned out as he silently tries to process all of the recent paranormal drama, realizing that this royal guard life is definitely not what he signed up for. Yuri glances back and shouts at him, which finally breaks him out of his strange daydream, as the knight looks incredibly shaken and begins to experience weird flashbacks of a past life that does not even exist. He scratches his head, half convinced he is finally losing his sanity, but yells back that he is coming and runs to catch up with the prince. The Death Knight steps up to the enormous crystal and slowly lowers himself down onto its base, as if his ancient, weary knees have just finally given out, as he strikes a dramatic pose and radiates a pure, overwhelming aura. The crystal begins to glow with an intense light, which forces the entire squad to shield their sensitive eyes, while the skeleton declares that he hopes the prince is truly worthy. Instantly, Yuri is teleported into a completely barren, desert-like realm and starts spinning around in a panic and wonders where in the world he has now landed. He spots a shadowy figure approaching in the far distance, and for a moment, he thinks it might be the founder himself. But that hope is quickly extinguished when he realizes the thing is not even remotely human and is already charging at him at full, terrifying speed. With a legendary sword in his hand, he barely manages to block the incoming attack and grunts from the immense force of the blow. Locking his eyes on the being's blue, glowing orb, he stares in sheer disbelief as he realizes that this thing is actually wielding a mana-forged sword. The transparent fighter gestures towards the glowing, blue orb that is embedded within its chest, which leaves Yuri feeling rather baffled. But it certainly does not end there. The blue glow begins to flow through its transparent body and then spreads into its powerful sword, causing that to light up as well. Yuri keeps his own sword raised, remaining fully on guard, but begins to understand that what he is witnessing is the actual fundamental method to wielding mana itself. His confusion only deepens when the being suddenly gestures at him. He shouts at the creature, asking if it seriously expects him to copy its precise movements, even though they're clearly supposed to be in the middle of a duel to the death. Right now, scratching his head in confusion, Yuri mutters that the founder must have truly lost his mind before he finally perished. The very concept of throwing someone who has never even touched the mana method into a real battle to teach them by force sounds like the kind of move only someone living their second life would even imagine. He comes to the conclusion that someone might as well be him. Yuri crouches down and concentrates as he begins channeling mana into the palm of his hand and watches as it begins to glow softly. He is struggling to understand how to properly use the technique, but he raises his sword and calls out to the faceless figure, saying that he is still not getting the hang of it. He asks it to demonstrate the technique properly one more time, and he gets a wild, eager grin in response as the being raises its powerful sword once again. That very moment strikes Yuri, as he realizes he has no other choice but to grow stronger no matter what it takes. He stands off against the ethereal warrior and fiercely swears that, since the Empire is destined to reveal its true, treacherous face, an attempt to invade the kingdom of Bryal, this time things will be very different. There is absolutely no way he will repeat his past failures, and he promises to completely annihilate them this time around, even if it means he must sacrifice his own life to do so. He tightens his determined grip on the sword and quietly mutters to himself that this must truly be the swordsmanship of the great ancestor king. Yuri does not hesitate for another single second as he charges forward at the speed of lightning, and slashes with his full, unwavering concentration, while he vows to absorb every single technique that is thrown at him, and begins his intense battle against the faceless fighter once again. Meanwhile, Jared slowly opens his eyes in a completely foreign space and looks around with a bewildered expression. He quickly ascertains that he is now standing in what appears to be a training ground, trying to locate any signs of another living being. He comes up completely empty and remarks that everything here feels far too tangible to be any sort of dream. He senses that something is amiss and clutches his sword tightly, while he yells out that whatever is hiding should cease acting afraid and just reveal itself already. Directly behind him, someone begins to approach him, and he spins around, fully prepared for a fight, but then freezes in a state of confusion, where he comes face to face with a perfect mirror image of himself. He wonders out loud if this is meant to be the Death Knight's twisted idea of a trial. He calmly asks the copy for its given name, and whether it is also supposed to be named Jared. Finally, the strange doppelganger opens its mouth and tells him that he should not be attempting to defy his own fate, a statement which completely throws Jared off. The copy smugly questions if he did not originally join the Royal Guards to simply live an easy life filled with riches. It adds that he should maintain his distance from the third prince, and warns him that the more he struggles against fate, the more miserable his life will ultimately become. While Jared narrows his eyes and listens to this in complete silence, taking a deep, centering breath, he looks down at his own sword and comes to a realization that perhaps the old version of him would have agreed with all of that. But things are no longer the same as they once were. His mind flashes back to all of those intense sparring matches with the prince. A wide, confident grin spreads across his determined face as he calls out his fake counterpart for being so bitter, and he begins to spit some pure Shakespeare, stating that once a blade has been swung, your only duty is to focus on preparing for the next one. Because if you get too caught up in what has already transpired, it will only serve to mess up your mind even further. The fake Jared does not let that statement pass and ignites his mana sword with a taunt, calling him arrogant. He sprints forward and launches a powerful jab, but Jared manages to parry it with surprising ease. As their swords clash repeatedly, Jared quickly picks up on the pattern and thinks to himself about how boring this copy truly is, never taking any real risks and pouring everything into its defense. The clone leaps high into the air, but Jared sees right through the move. Right away, he thinks back on how painfully dull he himself used to be and lands a clean strike that sends his double crashing to the ground. Jared takes a victorious breath, but remains on guard just in case. Sure enough, the fake begins to melt into a bizarre, gooey substance, and the real Jared watches intently as it transforms into a massive, sludge-like beast. He realizes the true fight has only just begun. The knight stares down the enormous, amorphous creature and mutters that it is just another loud, mindless brute, and silently hopes that the prince is managing to hold his own too. Readying his powerful sword, he braces himself and mentally cheers for Yuri to hang on and emerge victorious. Meanwhile, back in the desolate desert-like area, the landscape is completely ravaged from all the intense sword strikes, and Yuri lies completely still within a crater, not moving an inch. The transparent being stands menacingly over him with its sword in hand, and approaches with deadly intent in its steps. Yuri still appears to be completely out of it and does not react at all, but the faceless fighter could not care in the slightest. It raises its great sword high above its head and brings it down with force, unleashing a massive explosion that completely rocks the battlefield. However, just as the transparent figure brings its sword crashing down, Yuri drops his clever act as he clutches his sword tightly and floods it with immense mana. He thrusts it directly towards the unsuspecting being. With acrobat-like reflexes, the creature manages to bend backwards just in the nick of time to dodge, though the swing still sets off a massive and powerful mana explosion, as nimble and graceful as ever. The faceless fighter leaps back several steps while Yuri exhales sharply as he finally gets a second to catch his breath. He wonders to himself just how long this epic duel has been raging on. He admits that his last move was extremely reckless and foolish, but the way he had slashed and the way the mana surged through his blade, especially the way he fought as if his life hinged on every single clash, that is what finally helped him feel it all click into place. He stares down intently at the blade in his hand, now pulsing with a newfound power, and senses a major breakthrough. But before he can fully absorb it, Something else pulls his attention back to the fight, as he notices the transparent warrior is beginning to crack. Its sword splinters into countless fragments as its body starts breaking apart, and Yuri figures it out in an instant. The creature's allotted time is now up. Dust begins to peel off its limbs, and just before it completely fades away, it raises a hand in one final wave. The prince watches as the remains scatter into the empty air, with a strange, grateful smile tugging at his lips. He closes his eyes and quietly thanks his faceless, spectral mentor, right as his own form begins to dissolve into light as well. Eventually, Yuri groans and slowly opens his eyes, blinking away the lingering haze. As he looks around the area in a daze, his companions are also waking up and appear to have undergone a very similar trial as well. And that's when he realizes that they have finally returned. The Death Knight observes them and remarks smugly that it certainly seems as if they all had a very nice little dream. Yuri is still feeling slightly disoriented, but manages to ask what that entire experience even was. He is told it was all part of the founder's grand master plan, which is something he had left behind in case any of his future descendants ever made it to this sacred place. Yuri recalls how in his past, miserable life probably explains why the Scions of Brial had never before claimed this sacred legacy. However, unwilling to let the mystery lie, he questioned if the founder himself had wielded this very mana method. But the Spectral Guardian issued a denial. The founder did not employ it, but this was indeed his final masterpiece. For after traversing the entire continent, he gathered every technique he considered worthy and forged them all into a single ultimate technique. And Yuri is the very first descendant to inherit it. The prince wore a thoughtful expression and then posed the question, why did Eric not simply pass this technique directly to the royal lineage? The skeleton solemnly explained that the dungeon unseals itself only when the time is right. And since it opened now, it means this great power is needed. Yuri pressed, demanding what this precise timing signified. But the knight shut down that line of inquiry, stating it was not his place to reveal such a truth. Yuri would have to discover that crucial part for himself. He focused on the sword with renewed interest and asked for its name. And the Death Knight revealed its title, Soul Severance. The name echoed with a heavy resonance in Yuri's mind. But before he could ponder it further, the knight commanded him to bend the knee, as if preparing to bestow the sacred family heirloom. And his powerful aura made it clear he was not to be trifled with. Yuri instinctively dropped to his knees without a moment's hesitation, and the Death Knight placed a skeletal hand upon the boy's head and began to recite the sacred vow. He charged Yuri to never cower before his adversaries, and the prince responded with a firm, "I will not." He continued, commanding him to always follow his convictions, and regardless of the cost, fulfill Brial's duty until the very end. Then, without any prior warning, the knight gripped Yuri's head tighter and pulled it back, as he ordered him to focus intensely. And remember this next part with all his soul, that Brial never abandons its sacred honor, even if the price for it is life itself. With those final, resonant words, the Death Knight began to turn to dust as well, having at last fulfilled his eternal mission. His voice faded with one last declaration. This is the oath of Brial, while Yuri remained silent, only able to stare at the fading spectral knight. The next morning, his maid burst in and threw open the curtains, and cheerily announced that morning had arrived from beneath the covers. Yuri groaned in protest, and she asked if he was feeling exhausted, since he had apparently returned home incredibly late last night, and warned him not to lay back down or he would fall asleep again. Yuri yawned and clarified that he had made a stop at the Royal Archives, which was the reason he returned so late. The maid seemed intrigued and asked why he had done that, and he replied that he was searching for a very specific record. While searching through the family archives the previous night, Yuri had stumbled upon something fascinating. The records indicated that the founder had a younger sibling, someone who had cast aside their own honor, and then simply vanished from the pages of history without a single trace. Gazing at the legendary sword now, Yuri deduced that this brother must have been the Death Knight, and that the sword had originally belonged to him. She reminded him that he should probably get himself dressed, since the king was apparently awaiting an audience with him, which caused Yuri's heart to nearly leap out of his chest. She added that she was uncertain of the reason why, but following Hernando's meeting with His Majesty, the king had immediately summoned him. Yuri began sweating profusely and cursed Hernando's name in his head. As the events of the previous night came flooding back to him, he remembered Hernando's smug face, telling him in no uncertain terms that he was going to report the entire incident to the king. Yuri asked if that was truly a necessary course of action, but the maid just smirked and said he felt that it was. Yuri grabbed his head in sheer stress and realized that everything must have been reported by this point. Later, inside the magnificent, gleaming royal hall, Yuri stood beneath an enormous chandelier that looked expensive enough to bankrupt an entire city, and announced that he had arrived as requested. The king sat upon his throne, a hand rubbing his weary temple, and was clearly unsure of what to even do with him. At this point in time, he began by stating that Hernando had already revealed everything, and he scolded him fiercely for sneaking away from the palace. Not to mention that he somehow managed to find the secret dungeon and emerged with the founder's sacred legacy. Yuri did not deny any of it and admitted it was all true, but that did not stop the king from rising from his grand seat and asking if he truly found the legendary sword down there, which Yuri confirmed to be the truth as well. His Majesty then approached him with slow, deliberate steps, as his tone grew heavy, stating that as of late, he has heard from many people that Yuri has changed a great deal. The king narrowed his eyes and began to rattle off a list of names, listing every single person who had spoken to him about Yuri's sudden change in personality, with the final nail in the coffin being Hernando himself. Placing a heavy hand upon his son's head, the king commanded him to speak now, and demanded to know what exactly had happened to cause this profound transformation. Yuri gulped nervously as he held his sword even tighter, but remained completely silent. The king did not relent and pressed him again, asking if he did not wish to provide a reason. Yuri stammered that it wasn't that, but the king interjected and wondered why he was hesitating. Then the prince replied that he was afraid, because his Majesty had been clenching his fist tightly this entire time. Finally realizing this, the king relaxed his grip and told him to spit it out already. Yuri finally confessed, saying that he had experienced a dream, which immediately put the king on high alert. But Yuri continued, stating that within the dream, he had committed a truly unforgivable sin. The king still looked unconvinced and repeated the phrase slowly. Using his full royal name, Father Fiore asked directly what this unforgivable act he had committed was that led to such a dramatic change in his attitude. While Yuri just stared back at him, eyed his solemn eye, Yuri paused for a long, heavy second before finally admitting that his sin was failing to protect Brial until the very bitter end. In the dream, the kingdom was engulfed in the brutal chaos of war, and countless innocent souls were extinguished without any mercy. The prince desperately tried to turn the tide and hold his ground, but ultimately failed completely. After Brial had fallen, he had fled in utter shame, where he was stripped of his honor and died as a miserable, broken-down man. He clutched his chest and continued that. When he finally awoke from that nightmare, the precious necklace his mother had once given him was suddenly gone. That is when he began to suspect this was not just a mere dream, but some sort of divine warning from his dear mother herself. The king looked slightly unsettled by that and inquired which specific force was exactly responsible for destroying their kingdom in his dream. Yuri panicked internally, as he knew it was far too soon to throw the Empire's name into the ring. There was still a small but tangible chance that the devastating invasion could be delayed or stopped entirely with the correct strategic moves. So instead, he played it safe and answered that he did not know for certain, and that it was simply a black armored army that came out of nowhere. The king let out a soft, quiet sigh. Then he smiled and told him it was likely just a terrible nightmare, and perhaps a divine warning from his mother as well. But he was glad that his son was finally deciding to act like a man now. Yuri did not seem entirely convinced, as deep within his soul, he knew he was fighting to be forgiven for the sin of running away and leaving Brial and all of its people behind to rot. But his train of thought was abruptly cut short, as the king straightened up and mentioned there was something else that still needed to be addressed. His Majesty crossed his arms and commanded him to draw his sword. Fiore Brian is a true prodigy, one who probably began slashing things before he could even properly speak. a walking calamity with a sword who dominated all things and all people. His very name was carved into the history of the continent through sheer, unmatched skill, raw, innate talent, and a level of peerless martial prowess that had no right existing within a single mortal man. Back then, there was talk of the top 10 strongest people alive, and Fiore was the kind of man who comfortably hovered right at the top of that list. As Yuri stood in the training hall facing this living legend, he suddenly came to a realization that his old man was likely considered the greatest sword master on the entire continent. He glanced around the vast room in absolute awe and muttered that he had never even been inside his father's personal training space before. Fiore replied that he had never expected any of his sons to possess the innate talent for swordsmanship to begin with. Yuri gritted his teeth at that sharp jab and muttered that he does have talent, while the king just let out a long, weary sigh and repeated the single word, talent. Then, out of nowhere, he raised his own sword and aimed it directly at the young prince, which caught him completely and utterly off guard. He began to list off all the usual common physical skills, such as speed, reflexes, and instinct, and asked if possessing all of those automatically makes one the world's greatest swordsman, still holding his blade at Yuri's very throat. He answered his own question, stating none of those are the correct answer, and that the most critical thing is the internal drive that pushes a swordsman far beyond their perceived limits. His gaze sharpened and grew incredibly heavy as he explained that it transcends mere duty or a simple expectation. But then, all of a sudden, his eyes began to glow a menacing red. Yuri's entire body stiffened as he sensed the sheer, crushing pressure rolling off him, and that the aura surrounding him had completely transformed into something truly terrifying. Fiore lowered his great sword and continued that he does not even know how to put that feeling into proper words. So instead, he simply refers to it as the sword's calling. Yuri stared in complete surprise and lowered his own practice sword, and quietly asked if that was meant to mean destiny or something similar. Fiore closed his eyes and conceded that it could be called that. Yuri fell silent as his thoughts began to spiral once more, and he recalled that he was never destined to wield a sword in his previous life and wondered what had now changed. All of a sudden, his eyes flicked towards the blade in his hands, as if he were searching for some sort of answer in its cold reflection. Fiore interrupted and posed yet another question, asking if Yuri should even be holding that sword at all. He pushed further and asked if Yuri could even hear the sword's calling, and demanded to know if he would still hold on to it, even while staring directly into the cold face of death. Yuri was completely shaken as he stammered to get an answer out, saying that he doesn't feel anything at all in the first place. However, he was met with the ice-cold, piercing gaze of his father and became frightened as he took a hesitant step back on very wobbly legs. Suddenly, it felt as if he were being watched by evil, malevolent eyes surrounding him, and he began to completely spiral out of control. His past life's worst memories came rushing back like a violent tidal wave, as he remembered his loyal and steadfast comrades, screaming at him to dodge and to run far away, while others cried desperately for his help. They called out his name, but he could not even answer their desperate pleas. The world around him warped and shifted, and once again, he found himself back in his old life, where everything was burning around him. The relentless soldiers of the Empire marched ever forward, as they trampled the lifeless body of Hernando beneath their feet. Innocent civilians were being slaughtered without any hesitation, while the older version of Yuri just stood there helplessly and watched as it all unfolded before him. He suddenly gasped and looked around in sheer horror, and wondered why Bryal was now burning to the ground. Out of nowhere, a voice called out that it was the third prince over there, the last surviving prince of the once great Bryal family. Enemy soldiers quickly spotted him and began to close in, while he stared down at his own trembling, useless hands. That is when the brutal, undeniable truth struck him like a hammer, that somehow he had been dragged back to the precise moment when Bryal was annihilated. Bryal is being burned to the very ground, and the Imperial army is now hunting for Prince Yuri of Bryal. Yuri's mind was reeling and spinning as he found himself back in this very same place all over again, only to be pursued once more for being the last surviving Brioline and the sole heir who can restore the lost and tarnished honor of Bryal. The boy was completely frozen on the spot, utterly stunned and unsure how it was even possible for him to be here. The Imperial army was itching to finally eliminate the prince. One of them even lunged from behind to try and take his head clean off, but Yuri sensed the murderous intent creeping up on him and readied his sword just in the nick of time. He turned and dodged the lethal strike like a seasoned professional, just barely managing to evade it. Now, it was a full-on clash of steel blades. Raw, brute strength clashing as Yuri struggled to hold his ground. With one powerful, solid swing, the boy sliced the Imperial soldier's throat clean in half. One immediate threat was down, but before he could catch his breath, he heard his own loyal men shouting out, jumping in to valiantly protect their prince. They were all screaming at Yuri to make a run for it, while they attempted to buy him some precious time. He did not want it to end in this tragic way, but they were begging and pleading for him to go. One by one, the Imperial army mercilessly cut them all down, in the midst of the raging inferno. Yuri's head was spinning, wondering if this was still some kind of terrible nightmare. Also, questioning whether this was truly the fate Brial was doomed to face, trapped in a state of pure helplessness, as he came to terms with the fact that this was not yet the end, knowing that it could not be stopped either. Something deep inside of him finally snapped. The last prince of Brial stood tall before the burning ruins of his fallen, cherished kingdom, a kingdom that he was unable to save. Meanwhile, the Imperial army charged in viciously from behind, convinced that this was their chance to wipe out the last remaining Brioli. Royal heir. Yuri saw them coming, his powerful grip tightening around his trusty sword. He knew that the fight would not simply stop here, but he had already made his solemn vow. No matter the situation, he swore he would never fear the enemy again, with that blazing fire in his eyes. Prince Yuri turned to finally face the Imperial army, while a deep voice from within pushed him steadily forward, reminding him to stand by what he truly believes in. That voice now echoed loudly in his mind, drilling in the undeniable truth that he has a sacred duty to Brial, and he was going to see it through to the very bitter end. Yuri gripped his blade tightly and charged at them at full speed, his powerful strike slicing through tough armor and flesh in a single motion. The vile scum from the Imperial army dropped dead right on the spot, their crimson blood splashing into Yuri's eyes and nearly blinding him. But even with his vision now blurred, the boy managed to block a soldier's spear with his bare hand, just in the nick of time. Seizing the crucial moment, Yuri drove his trusty sword straight into the soldier's vulnerable gut. Breathing heavily, he heard a voice telling him to prepare himself for death, saying that his time was now up. It wanted him to just give up already, but the raw, unbridled pain in his voice exploded with pure defiance. Brial will never throw away its sacred honor, even if it means dying a noble death for it. With that burning fury, Yuri lunged at the Imperial army like a wild beast, ready to carve out their very graves right then and there to fulfill Brial's solemn duty. Just then, little Yuri mumbled that he would protect Brial's honor until the very end. Fiori's voice suddenly cut through, waking the poor, terrified kid up and asking if he could hear it. One loud call of Yuri's name finally snapped him out of it, and the shaken boy found himself staring at the black-armored army, while his powerful father, Fiori, gently calmed him down. He revealed it was all just a powerful illusion. The very moment Yuri had gripped the sword, it had triggered a deep, tragic memory, and now his hand was completely drenched in cold sweat. From the intense look in his eyes, his father seemed to realize that he may have been mistaken, and now he wanted Yuri to take up the sword for real. Little Yuri smiled brightly at him, saying that he had finally made his decision. But then he suddenly paused, kind of weirded out by the strange, odd expression on his father's face. Anyone looking at him now would think that Yuri had just signed his own personal death warrant, or something of that nature. Suddenly, the boy tugged at his father and told him to relax a bit. The old man was caught completely and utterly off guard, stunned by the sheer guts his son had to throw him a reality check like that. Little Yuri burst out laughing and confidently declared, "I'm a genius, after all." His father's face twitched right before he smacked Yuri soundly on the head. Later that morning, under the soft, gentle light of the sunrise, and a pleasant, cool breeze blowing through the field, Bernard strolled by and caught a glimpse of young Yuri, icing the large, new bump on his head. He could not help but ask whose brilliant idea that was, and Yuri nonchalantly said it was from his own dad. Bernard, shaking his head in disbelief, joked that the old man must be feeling particularly generous today. Still, he warned Yuri that from this day forward, his training was going to become much tougher. No more holding back whatsoever. Yuri was already prepared for that. Thinking back on it, the kid realized that Bernard's reason for living in Bryall probably had a great deal to do with his powerful father. Seeing his chance now, Yuri finally asked if Bernard had to agree to some special condition, like a legendary duel with his dad that convinced him to stay in Bryall. The old man did not even hesitate for a moment before saying yes. So Yuri took that condition out of the equation and asked, if not for that, would Bernard have still chosen to stay? The answer was a firm and flat no. And Bernard laughed when Yuri then called him heartless. Still, the old man knew that this little prince just wanted him to stick around. Bernard said he might possibly consider the offer if Yuri could present him with a good enough reason. Anything sufficiently tempting would do, since his old bones might just be willing to forget everything else. Little Yuri was shaken to his very core when Bernard suddenly picked up on the distinct vibe and asked if he truly wished to learn the art of swordsmanship. The kid was scared completely out of his wits, while Bernard was now lost in his own thoughts, clearly concocting something up in that head of his. He was quite curious to see how this all would turn out. Yuri found the entire idea to be a bit overwhelming, especially since Bernard carried a fearsome nickname like Sword Demon. But the old man just shrugged and said it was all right. If Yuri had not yet mastered anything of substance, he would take that into careful consideration. Yuri said it probably would not be of much assistance, then pulled out his sword and revealed his unique style. Swordsmanship that was infused with raw mana. The mana flowed directly through the blade itself, something Bernard admitted he had never seen or even heard of before. From what he knew, mana was typically just used to enhance sword skills, not to become one with the very weapon itself. Yuri explained that was precisely why it was so difficult to pass down, because it would invariably end up being incomplete. But Bernard surprised him by stating that he was fine with that. He was willing to accept it, even if it was not yet perfect. And now he was making that the new condition to remain in Bryall. At the very least, he was confident he would understand a part of it. Yuri was impressed by the old man's unwavering confidence and officially confirmed Bernard's continued stay in Bryall, just as they had both previously agreed. With that finally settled, Bernard told the kid to show him something and got into his position. Yuri Bryall, gripping his powerful sword, demonstrated his unique Simhanchum technique. In the middle of it all, Bernard casually dropped a bombshell. He had never actually intended to leave Bryall in the first place. His Majesty had already requested for him to stay for another 10 years. That sudden revelation struck Yuri like a ton of heavy bricks. The kid realized he had just been played in a big, major way. Before he could even properly react, Bernard smirked and reminded him he was supposed to be attacked. But Yuri was done waiting, so he decided to strike at him first. This old bag of bones was seriously getting on his last nerves. He blocked Bernard's powerful attack with all of his might, their respective blades crashing together in a sharp, loud clash. Later that evening, little Yuri lay on his comfortable bed, lost in a veritable flood of deep thoughts. He began to feel as if the future was actively shifting. Not the same dark future where Bryall burned because of his grave mistakes. He hadn't accomplished anything major just yet. But the fact that Bernard had chosen to remain in Bryall was undeniable proof that something was already changing. The future had always felt so uncertain and out of his reach, but now it was shifting little by little. Even so, Yuri knew that it was not yet enough. Deep down inside, he was fully determined to bring the entire empire to its knees. The kid was now ready to make that happen. Out of the blue, the maid Ina then showed up, hoping that Yuri would not stir up any more trouble. From this point forward, curious, Yuri asked her what other plans she was hiding. Ina, clearly accustomed to his usual antics, brought up how he always had some new excuse to ask for her help. Then she dropped the important news. There was a meeting tomorrow at the prestigious Elders' Council, and she hoped that he had not forgotten about it. She had clearly had more than enough of his silly shenanigans. His father casually added that Yuri would be joining them as well, which was completely new and surprising information to him. Ina reminded him that it was the first thing in the morning, and that most of the council would be in attendance. Just then, she grabbed little Yuri's small hand, her own eyes sparkling with mischief, as she warned him the place would be full of scary old folks, but she really hoped that he would not end up punching anyone. He laughed nervously, assuring her that there was nothing to worry about. He was not the same person that he used to be. And with that, he promised Ina that he would behave himself. The next day, at the August Elders Council, the very first thing that Yuri noticed was the overwhelming opposition. No doubt about it. Ina had been absolutely correct. Duke Chinnard was the first one to finally speak up, bringing immediate attention straight to the prince's chosen mana method. The old man strongly opposed the very idea of the prince learning such a completely unverified mana technique. What was supposed to be a council for discussing national affairs had clearly and completely lost its original purpose, turning into little more than just a roadblock against all royal authority. Now Yuri finally understood why his father used to avoid this council altogether. Duke Chinnard, leader of the West, insisted that Yuri should stick to the traditional, established Brial method. Instead, this royal member immediately and vocally objected, claiming the so-called unverified technique was actually the founder's own sacred legacy. The big man in the room demanded solid, irrefutable proof to back up that claim. This royal member was clearly and visibly irritated that the Duke was now doubting the prince's own personal beliefs. But the Duke argued it was all a matter of safety, saying that everyone was gathered here out of genuine concern for the prince's future. Yuri could not help but find it all a little bit amusing that the entire elders council was going back and forth over his chosen mana method. It almost felt like a great honor, especially considering that after Brial had fallen, the very same man who had bowed his head to the emperor was now speaking with such a smooth, silver tone. It was all more than a little bit ironic. The Duke then called for the esteemed opinion of Saint Ed, the captain of the revered royal guard. Saint, attempting to remain completely neutral, admitted that he was not sure. Every mana method has its own pros and cons, and people all have their own different affinities. The Duke immediately jumped on that statement, using it to push his own personal agenda, by pointing out that even the Royal Guard captain harbors his own doubts, so it would be better to discard the entire thing. The royal member quickly and fiercely countered, saying that Saint had meant that each mana method holds its own intrinsic value. The Duke's loyal sidekick then jumped in, accusing the Duke of being worried that the method might somehow harm the prince. Yuri sensed the mood shifting very fast, and he was not liking it one bit. In just a few short seconds, the entire council had completely turned against him. If he had not already put in the diligent work with the mana method, he would be stuck rebuilding his very core from the ground up. But since he had stuck to the founder's original, powerful vision, his Samhankam was already deeply and firmly rooted in his core. Yuri was now at a complete loss for words, tense and unsure of how to move forward from this point, as the heavy weight of the council's harsh judgment hung over him. Just as the oppressive silence began to feel suffocating, a new voice cut cleanly through the silent hall, sharp and surprisingly casual, saying, "They sure know how to talk big." All eyes turned as the free baron, Calcio Arantia, stepped confidently forward, shattering the immense tension with a knowing smirk. He posed a simple question to the entire room, asking who among them had ever actually fought an orc. The entire room's collective attention immediately shifted to Calcio, the very atmosphere changing as a few of the members began to whisper amongst themselves. Duke Chinnard raised a single eyebrow and asked who he was and what rank he supposedly held, clearly attempting to gauge whether he even belonged at this table. Calcio Arantia stepped up with confidence and casually introduced himself as a mere free baron. The big man looked incredibly surprised, almost deeply offended that someone of that low status would dare to attend the Elders' Council. Calcio admitted he had never planned on coming here, either, but he had no other choice. After Count Seymour had personally delegated the important task to him, Yuri's eyes widened at the mere mention of Count Seymour. The legendary name brought back a flood of memories. He was the border count, the one who guarded the outer edges of Brial, a lord renowned for fighting on the very front lines. That man was a true, living legend. A genuine soldier who had spent his entire life on the battlefield, and now his name was being dropped in this very same hall. Although Yuri was well aware that Count Seymour had little to no interest in these noble gatherings, he still could not figure out why the man would even bother sending a personal representative to the council. The royal member beat him to the very same question, asking why exactly Count Cedar had sent Calcio here. Calcio, with a very sly and knowing grin, joked that Cedar wanted him to witness all of the snooty nobles talk big and grand about politics without ever actually doing anything. After watching everything unfold here, He admitted it all made perfect sense now why Cider had sent only him. Then, shifting the tone, Calcio explained that on the real battlefield, the type of mana method one uses does not matter. Whether it is the Empire's dreaded Lion Fong art, or Bryal's own traditional sacred method, what truly and ultimately counts is the person wielding it. He then turned to Yuri, saying he would like to hear the prince's own thoughts on the entire matter. Seizing the perfect opportunity, Yuri stepped boldly forward and expressed his deep desire to learn the founding king's own mana method. What truly confused him was why it was even causing so much heated controversy in the first place. And with that, Prince Bryal made his intentions crystal clear. No matter what anyone else might say, he was going to pursue the founder's mana method, one way or another. Calcio went on to say that the sword-bearing prince was clearly set on following the will and chosen method of their own founder. He then added that most of the people present in this room have neither the valid authority nor the sole responsibility to speak on this very matter, especially when it does not concern them in any direct way. He took a verbal jab at the lazy nobles who were glued to their scholarly chairs, saying that anyone who has never once stepped foot onto a battlefield should not even have a single say in the matter. Duke Jenner commented that the free baron certainly speaks quite bluntly. Calcio simply smiled and said that slaying orcs tends to rub the polite manners off of a person, so he hoped that the Duke could graciously overlook that. He then circled back to his original, piercing question. An orc. A heavy, stunned silence descended upon the entire room. Calcio, however, refused to relent, pressing his advantage, proclaiming that ravenous beasts have no concern for one's mana method. His every word dripped with the weight of the battlefield, making everyone uneasy. The Duke's subordinate conceded Calcio's point to an extent, but argued that Yuri was still a child who lacked sound judgment. Yuri did not accept that insult and fired back immediately, demanding to know if the Duke's lackey dared to question his judgment. He declared to all that his mana method could not simply be discarded or rebuilt as if it were some trivial matter. Calcio supported him, stating Yuri was not one to surrender so readily, and then asked if the council actually intended to forcibly rip the core from the boy's body. The subordinate's fury began to boil over, but Calcio remained utterly unfazed, highlighting just how utterly futile this entire debate was becoming. At this moment, you could almost see Yuri becoming a devoted Calcio fan. He offered him a silent, grateful smile for the intervention. Calcio then laid out the cold, hard truth. He stated they were actively harming the prince's well-being by squandering time on these meaningless arguments. It was as if the royal capital possessed the great luxury to sit around and debate utter nonsense. That was the final straw that shattered Duke Jennet's composure, clearly incensed after receiving what felt like a verbal slap to the face. He snapped back at Calcio, accusing the border of draining the treasury, while maintaining a convenient and telling silence that struck a raw nerve. Calcio's sharp glare cut into him as he retorted, "Does it only cease being quiet when 100 men have perished?" The man added a grim truth about the reality on the front lines, saying there are daily reports of soldiers falling in battle out there. It is hard to fathom that no one here has spared even a minute to hear about any of it. He mentioned that on the very day he departed the border, word had arrived that 4 more soldiers had lost their lives, one of whom was a friend he had shared his breakfast with. That very same morning, he quietly confessed that he had laid the burial shroud himself before making his journey here. With that, he made it clear that the monstrous orcs do not rest. They are a race that was born for nothing but battle and bloodshed. His words sparked a distant memory within Yuri, reminding him of the conflict between Bryal and the Klein Duchy. Back then, that rising tension gave the orcs an opportunity to cross the border and wreak absolute havoc. Yuri asked if things had been different recently, and Calcio informed him they had been far more concerning than usual. Yuri also inquired if the Klein soldiers were present at the border, but Calcio revealed the border guards had suddenly withdrawn their forces. That is when Yuri learned the nearby villages had been burned to ashes, with their people either enslaved or mercilessly slaughtered. It left him wondering if this was escalating into a full-blown civil war, or if Duke Jennet's third son had committed some grievous error. Everyone listened to the grim report in absolute, stunned silence, unsure how the young prince was even maintaining his composure. Without waiting a moment longer, Prince Yuri brought the council to a close and rose to depart. Duke Jenner attempted to interject, But Yuri cut him off with a cold, dismissive glare. He threw shade at the so-called noble for wasting precious time on such trivial matters as mana methods. He told them bluntly they would be better served focusing their energy on actual problems, like reinforcing the defenses against the Duchy of Klein and the Orcs. With that, our prince landed a devastating blow, not with a sword, but to the fragile pride of every corrupt noble in the hall, commanding them to cease their obsession with a mere boy and to start performing their actual duties. Later, the entire debacle involving the third prince reached the ears of the great Count Cider, as Calcio relayed to him what had transpired at the Elders' Council. He told Cedar that the boy seemed like an entirely different person. Now, Cedar then asked for Calcio's sincere opinion, and Calcio simply replied that the prince's eyes did not look bad to him. Taking that assessment into account, Cedar tasked Calcio with keeping a very close watch on the third prince, and perhaps even probing a little deeper. With that, Cedar concluded the call through the communication crystal, stating they would speak again very soon. After the magical connection was severed, Calcio stood there alone, contemplating how soldiers continue to die on the dangerous borders, while everything in the capital felt so unnervingly peaceful. Just then, he spotted the third prince taking a stroll outside. Hernando, at Yuri's specific request, had snuck out of the palace with him like a pair of wanted runaways. Yuri began to tease him, asking if he used to escape from home 3 times a day like he does. Hernando laughed and called himself quite the youthful delinquent. Yuri failed to see why this bumbling mage was so incredibly excited when he had the freedom to wander about whenever he desired. But Hernando lived for the sheer thrill of such a rebellion, especially when it involved doing something utterly forbidden, like a prince sneaking out of the grand royal palace. He asked for the details of their scandalous plan, but Yuri simply shrugged and said that nothing particularly wild was going to happen while he was around. Still, Hernando pressed him to finally reveal what was truly going on. It turns out, Yuri was plotting to visit the largest illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was stunned. He thought Yuri wasn't going to do anything reckless. Now the kid was begging him to reveal the directions to the establishment, claiming it was all for the greater good of Bryal. That instantly flipped a very important switch inside Hernando. He suddenly lit up with pure excitement and happily agreed to lead the way, eager to help turn that entire casino completely upside down. Among the many names that everyone in Bryal tossed around in his past life, a select few always stood out. This included the king of the underworld, who also served as a massive, ruthless loan shark, and the great business titan who built the continent's largest and most successful trading company. Next, Bryal's shadowy streets were seized by a new kind of fear, thanks to the legendary assassin who took off the crime boss's very head. The man who was eventually assassinated was named Goryo. Yet here he now stood, the underworld's most powerful loan shark, standing directly before little Yuri. Goryo said it was a great honor to host such highborn guests in his casino, and Yuri instantly understood that Goryo was already aware that they were the third prince and the esteemed royal mage, which was why he had come down to greet them in person. Yuri made it perfectly clear he was not here merely to gamble. Goryo caught the immediate shift in tone and smoothly transitioned into business mode. Meanwhile, Hernando looked completely and utterly betrayed. He had come here chasing thrills and high-stakes poker tables, not to engage in complex political power plays. Yuri silenced him with a single, sharp look. Goryo asked if Yuri was there to borrow some money. It turned out Yuri was actually considering flipping it into a major investment, but Goryo saw right through his clever ruse. The kid was clearly building his own personal stash on the side, and the fact that he had come to him instead of a legitimate bank made the entire situation a whole lot more interesting. Goryo deduced that the third prince had much bigger plans and some serious, burning ambition hidden behind those young eyes. But Yuri was not looking to get into the specific details. He shut that line of questioning down, reminding Goryo that asking questions was not part of his job description. Goryo immediately backed off, shifting gears and offering an apology. Yuri then leaned in closer, casually pointing out that he was the one borrowing the money here. Goryo needed to know what the funds were even for. It turned out Yuri was aiming to buy up all the mogranza, a very rare spice from the distant Claim Mountains. He bet that the available supply would not come close to meeting the demand. Hernando felt like everything was moving a little too quickly for his comfort. Goryo knew that mogranza played a key role in crafting high-end luxury perfumes, but he was still unsure if it was worth betting a large sum of money on. Yuri, however, was absolutely certain that the buzz around it would kick in very soon. Hernando knew of the civil war that was brewing in the Klein Principality, and of the orcs that were roaming freely throughout the region. Casting serious doubt on whether the spice prices would truly explode, he began to suspect that the kid might just be attempting to corner the market on a local rarity before anyone else could possibly catch on to his plan. Still, the way that Yuri carried himself made it abundantly clear that he was not just throwing darts in the dark. Even Goryo got the distinct sense that Yuri Bryal was not some naive noble boy playing at being a merchant. The kid was highly calculated, incredibly sharp, and probably knew a lot more than he was letting on. Now Yuri began to work out all of the numbers, not as a prince, but as a very serious and shrewd investor. Goryo took his sweet time thinking the whole thing through before finally having the kid sign the official agreement. Yuri was all smiles, clearly pleased with the deal that he had just secured. Hernando, meanwhile, could not wrap his head around how this kid had the sheer guts to borrow such a huge sum from Goryo. Of all people, the guy was still grumbling, whining that no one had given him a proper heads up, and was extra salty that they hadn't even gambled yet. Yuri knew perfectly well that this guy would have dragged him straight back to the royal castle and right in front of his intimidating father, so he had kept it all completely under wraps. Now he had important business to handle at the Merchants Guild, and as far as the mogranza was concerned, the profits were already securely in the bag. Yuri was well aware that the first major casualty of the looming civil war would likely be the great alchemist, the only person who knew how to properly process the mogranza, and a trusted aide to Duke Klein. Until a replacement finally showed up, Yuri had already planned to sell the valuable spice at whatever price he wanted. He also knew better than to entrust this important job to just anyone, which is why they ended up at a rather sketchy, rundown-looking place. Hernando was seriously judging the kid for showing up somewhere as shabby as this. Yuri knocked firmly, calling out for Miss Rainwood, while Hernando kept on insisting that the main guild would have been a much smarter choice. Irene stepped out, looking completely and utterly clueless, asking what was currently going on. Yuri wasted no time in introducing himself and offering her a job. Meanwhile, the dim-witted mage was practically losing his mind over the simple fact that the third prince would stoop so low and attempt to hire someone like her. He was ripping into Yuri's overall judgment, baffled that he would trust the future of the mogranza's trade to some little, no-name shop, but with a truly wicked grin. Yuri knew that right at this moment, it might look like a nobody was running a shabby little trading company. Still, he knew one thing for absolute certain. Irene Wood was destined to become the greatest merchant on the entire continent, while Goryo used every dirty trick when things became rough. Irene, on the other hand, valued her sacred promises above all else. Little Yuri gave off a creepy smirk, knowing that in his past life, the woman had only made it as far as legendary merchant status. But this time around, Yuri was set on turning her into a full-blown myth. Hernando, still trying to keep up with everything, dared to ask if Yuri was finally done with all of his outside business. Yuri just shrugged, saying he had one final thing left to take care of. So Hernando ended up chasing after him once again, while Yuri was already thinking far ahead. The lone shark of the entire underworld and the future great merchant were both now on board with his grand plan. That left only one more crucial piece to complete the entire set. The two of them arrived at a very run-down, dilapidated street, where desperate beggars were fighting over mere scraps of old food. Yuri knew it had to be somewhere around here. And sure enough, his eyes landed on a small group of children. As the third prince, Yuri Bryal stepped forward and addressed the woman standing among them, the very same one who had killed Goryo in his previous life. That was the assassin of legend, Asana. Of course, the big question in the future assassin's mind was why the prince of the kingdom would ever stroll through these dirty slums. Yuri quickly assured her that he had come there with good intentions, and that there was no need to be so incredibly wary. In fact, he was here because he thought he could provide some assistance to the needy. He then turned to Hernando and gestured for the thing that they had prepared beforehand. The poor mage could not bear to part with it. In the end, He was forced to hand over the large sack that was filled to the brim with coins. The prince's keen gaze darted around, and he saw a little girl hiding timidly behind Asana, evidently very wary of the well-dressed and unfamiliar strangers. Yuri could tell that this specific child was the very reason. Asana had borrowed a large sum of money from Goryo in his past life. She had to bite the bitter bullet in order to get the little girl the crucial treatment she needed for her illness. Just like all those who had borrowed from the utterly ruthless loan shark, Asana's life quickly went downhill into complete ruin from that point on. This had eventually led her down the dark path of an assassin. She quickly made a fearsome name for herself in the underground world as one of the most highly skilled killers on the entire market. Yuri's little trip down to this forgotten slum was for the sole purpose of preventing that unfortunate fate from occurring. Without further elaboration, he handed Asana the heavy bag of coins and asked Asana to take the little girl to the temple to be properly treated. When she asked what he wanted in exchange for such a very large sum, he had a very short and simple answer with a bright, warm smile. All he asked for in return was for Asana to remember his full name, Yuri Bryal, the third prince of the entire kingdom. Afterward, they did not linger there for long and made their way out of the truly depressing part of the town. While walking out of that miserable and squalid area, Hernando still could not make any sense of why the prince would give all that cash to some completely random beggar. Well, it would be a very lucrative and profitable investment for the future. In a single, fateful night, he had forged invaluable connections with three of the most crucially important figures. In just a few years' time, he now had the key and essential figures he would need securely in his pocket. Aside from those powerful three, there was just one more person he needed to get into his own corner. He turned to Hernando and asked him a very simple question. He asked the carefree and whimsical mage what vision he had seen in the founding king's mysterious tomb. With a very wry and knowing smile, he answered that all he did in that strange dream world was gamble away. Yuri was not at all expecting such a completely silly answer. The mage then elaborated that he had played a high-stakes game in the Empire's Barthlegas casino with his own very life on the line. While it was surprising at first glance, knowing this particular degenerate gambler, a gambling den truly was his personal battlefield. Visions aside, Yuri now wanted Hernando to keep his mouth completely shut about everything that had happened that night. That meant keeping it a complete secret, even from the king himself, just as the third prince had fully expected. The court mage was summoned to the grand throne room to report on the prince's recent activities. Even though they had tried to sneak out without setting off any alarms, the king had still heard that they had gone out the previous night. Hernando did not even bother to deny their little excursion, so the king now wanted more specific details. The mage detailed how Yuri had practically forced him to leave the palace in the dead of the night. He truthfully then confessed that they had gone straight to the biggest, grandest casino in the capital. Scenes of their very shady dealings with that notorious loan shark flashed vividly in his mind. Of course, King Fiore would naturally assume that they went to that place to gamble and to waste a great deal of money. With the most genuine smile he could muster, the mage then lied straight through his teeth and answered that they did indeed spend money on the card tables. The king did not seem either surprised or upset. To sell the lie even better, Hernando then added that he had lost all the money he had lent to the young prince in various card games, which he was not particularly good at. When asked to elaborate further on what had happened last night, scenes of their truly bizarre trip flashed in his mind. They had taken the money, borrowed from the known underground dealer to some failing old merchant guild. Then, the rest of the coins were then donated to some random orphan in the slums. Of course, Hernando did not go into all of those details. In his own words, they had just walked around and saw how the common people lived. The prince was simply and purely interested in how his people lived their daily lives. Before the sun had risen, they were safely back inside the castle. Nothing more and nothing less than that. King Fiore took in the entire report with a stoic and wise discernment. He could easily tell that the court mage was not being entirely truthful, but he did not pry into the matter any further. Changing the subject entirely, he asked Hernando if he was planning to attend the grand ball being held soon. With a very jovial smile, the court mage confidently answered, yes. The king was quite surprised by this. This guy was not the type of person to go to such formal balls. But people's minds do change all the time. Besides, It had been a very long while since he had busted out his moves on the dance floor. Meanwhile, Yuri was back on the familiar training grounds for his daily, grueling spar with the legendary sword demon. As was now usual, he was down on his ass after a very thorough beating. While he was recovering from his most recent beatdown, he noticed some sort of commotion going on nearby, and he teased Bernard for being quite so popular with the various ladies of the castle. The maids kept on glancing over at the stalwart and handsome trainer, while blushing and murmuring excitedly amongst themselves. Yuri tried goading his stoic and serious teacher into attending the ball, to give the adoring ladies what they all clearly want. Bernard simply retorted that he had absolutely no interest in such frivolous things. That inherited and mysterious sword technique, on the other hand, had been on the back of his mind ever since he started trying it out. Unfortunately, the third prince had been absolutely right. No matter how hard he tried to make logical sense of the various moves, there was simply no decisive or recognizable form in the entire technique, since he could only put half of the complete whole into actual practice. To Yuri, the powerful soul severance technique came to him completely naturally. He moved along with the natural flow, without any discernible rhyme or reason. There was simply nothing else quite like it. A mana method that was directly linked to a powerful sword technique did not exist anywhere else. But Bernard did not want to give up on it. Perhaps by watching the third prince in a real and genuine fight would give him some better insight. As for their regular daily training, he was quite pleased with Yuri's overall progression, whether in pure, unadulterated swordsmanship or in his mana usage. To be completely honest, the kid's growth was absolutely astounding. In truth, this type of progress was not really progress at all. The prince was still trying to completely erase the traces of the brio method that he had completely mastered in his former past life. With a very stern concern, the sword demon asked the kid to never rush himself. He was worried that Yuri was now progressing way too quickly, faster than his still-growing body could possibly support. He had already achieved so much at such a very young age, but going at the current rate that he was going, certain complications might arise later on. With a confident smile, Yuri assured the old, worried sword nerd that he would always maintain a perfectly good balance. He knew his own body the very best. In fact, he could go for another intense sparring round right at this moment. To spice things up a bit, he tossed the wooden sword far away. He unsheathed the sacred ancestor's blade and, with a very cocky grin, challenged Bernard to draw his own weapon as well. The sword demon honored his bold request and elegantly drew his own weapon. For an extra, added layer of delicious risk, Yuri then proposed a bet. If he could successfully land a single attack, Bernard must then attend the upcoming ball. Of course, the sword nerd immediately declined such a ridiculous and silly wager. Besides, he was supremely confident that he would win in any case. Other than that, he had absolutely no faith that Yuri, with his zero amount of credibility, would ever honor any sort of bet made, ticked off by the simple fact that his own teacher was practically dismissing his open challenge. The third prince injected a surge of mana directly into his blade. He then took off like a speeding, deadly bullet, ready to pounce on any and every opening that he could possibly find. Yuri's powerful blade collided with Bernard's, master and student, clashing fiercely with bright smiles on their faces. Spoiler alert, the third prince ultimately lost. He still has a very long way yet to go. A few days later, the sounds of hooves galloping towards the magnificent castle could be heard from all across the sprawling kingdom. The momentous day of the grand ball had finally arrived. In one of the many luxurious and ornate carriages, a tall, blond man who was clad in shiny armor was peering through the small window. The empire's esteemed second prince, George Ivanov Granzian, was about to make his grand arrival. Sitting directly opposite him was none other than the little princess, Yekaterina Ivanov Granzian. It has been such a long time since she had last left the empire. Tonight, there was someone she really, truly wanted to meet. A few hours before the grand ball was set to start, the third prince was busy getting ready. He had finally ditched his simple and very comfortable clothes for something far more royal and much grander. In truth, he wanted nothing more than to just ditch this fancy, stuffy garb. All of the ornate decorations were far too flashy for his rugged, simple tastes. Aina argued that he used to greatly like extravagant things just like this before. After buttoning him up and straightening out his formal outfit, Aina then moved towards the large, wooden door. Before she could leave, the third prince invited her to a practice dance. He reasoned that he wanted to get some extra practice in, and that he did not have anyone else available to pair up with. Aina stammered, looking visibly bothered by the young master's sudden request. She reckoned that this mischievous boy must be planning to step on her foot, to get her to fall over or something of that nature. He smoothly took her by the hand, pulling Aina in closer while promising not to mess with her at all. No funny business of any kind would happen tonight. They were just dance partners, moving to the tune of their own private music. He took the lead, and she gracefully followed. Aina felt her maiden's heart skip a single beat, unable to so much as utter a single word, as the dashing young master swayed her around with such gentle care. When she finally calmed down, Aina bragged that she was a fairly good dancer. In response, he playfully asked who it was that she has been dancing with. Once more, Aina proudly boasted that she was quite the popular lady, but she had never once danced with someone so very short before. No worries, that significant height difference won't be a problem very soon. For a few precious minutes, the two of them freely danced beneath the pale moonlight, peering in through the large window. And Aina did step on his foot a few times. Inside the truly opulent and grand ballroom, the sounds of melodious music filled the great halls. The nobles and all of their partners took to the dance floor to show off their very elegant and graceful moves. Up in the highest viewing booth, King Fiore was sitting upon his mighty throne, drinking his fine wine while observing the ongoing festivities. Besides the long table with a wide and delicious spread of food, the three young princes were talking and laughing amongst themselves. While he was seemingly engaged in this conversation, Yuri was carefully and meticulously scanning the entire room. He could clearly see Count Seymour was in attendance. The man was truly different from the rest of the other knights. Surprisingly, he had not sent Baron Arantia as his proxy tonight. Yuri's eyes then darted towards his eldest brother's fancy glasses. He asked the crown prince if his own eyesight was getting even worse, but Big Bro assured Lil Bro that it was not yet bad enough to worry about. Finally, the royal trumpets then blared, signaling the grand arrival of some very important guests. The nobles all cleared out of the way as the second prince of the mighty empire valiantly rolled in with his posse. Prince George marched straight towards the king to pay his proper respects. Fiore shook the blondie's outstretched hand and politely thanked him for making the long and arduous trip. They exchanged a few more formal pleasantries, and George finally introduced everyone present to his dear little sister. When Yekaterina finally came into his view, Yuri felt a very heavy, sinking feeling deep in his stomach, in stark contrast to his own grim and somber look. The little princess was equally polite and graceful with her own greetings. Who would have ever thought that this angelic looking girl would spell the ultimate downfall of his very kingdom? Even now, Yuri can still vividly remember their sweet, shared memories together. Of course, he also knew of the inevitable and incredibly painful end. Her short, written apology on a small piece of paper, sent by a carrier pigeon, still haunts his very dreams, even in this new life. He vowed to never create any sort of rapport, or to even interact in the very slightest with this particular girl. He could not possibly afford to make the same costly and fatal mistake. Never again. His silent, internal brooding on the sidelines had caught the young princess's attention, while the other various princes of the kingdom threw out compliments and formal pleasantries. She just curtly responded to them with very polite, practiced smiles. The night continued on as it usually did, wherever the visiting princess went. Yuri made sure to steer well clear of the entire perimeter. Out on the bustling dance floor, he could see his own eldest brother dancing with some high-ranking noblewoman. As was to be expected of Cedric, he was as respectful and as graceful as ever. Yuri could see all of the fine qualities of a truly benevolent lord in that wonderful brother of his. Compared to that guy, he was like a completely uncultured and savage swan. He could not even smoothly avoid the Empire's princess for a single night. Thankfully, his second, older brother was always there to pester the young lady. Even though Yuri was carrying all of the immense baggage of the future that has not yet happened, the feelings and the memories were still there. Thankfully, Anna was there to help cheer him up. With her delicious, warm cookies and her bright, welcoming smile, he asked if serving all the guests in such a big event was tiring. She jokingly then answered that This event was nothing at all compared to attending to a certain someone. After taking all of the delicious cookies from her tray, Yuri's sour mood seemed to brighten up just a little bit. He leaned heavily against the large table, hoping that this long night of noble formalities would finally come to an end. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the Empire's second prince, approaching him with a very apprehensive and calculating gaze. In his past life, Georgi Varnon Granzin had become a truly legendary figure. He had commanded the vast troops on the field in place of the reigning king. Yuri's strict etiquette training quickly and instinctively kicked in. He politely and formally bowed and properly introduced himself as the third prince of the kingdom, to the very same man who had driven Brioel to its complete ruin. It took every single iota of his considerable willpower to remain calm, and to completely suppress his immense bloodlust against this very guy. Unfortunately for young Yuri, it looked as if Georgie had taken a very special interest in him. With a very sly and cunning smile, the second prince suddenly exuded a sharply oppressive and suffocating aura that wrapped tightly around his neck. It felt as if multiple coiling blades were now dancing and lightly touching all of his vital points. The second prince grimly asked if he had just turned 13 this very year. "We might just need the FBI here, dog." Without even waiting for a proper answer, George walked away with enough crucial information to discern that the third son of the great Fiore was quite a talented and impressive young man. Yuri clenched his fist tightly in pure frustration. The guy had just openly threatened him with a very intrusive and personal test. He could feel how strong and incredibly dangerous George truly was, and he was not even in his prime just yet. Those vile spawns of the Empire really were a bunch of complete bastards. Suddenly, the sharp sounds of wine glasses shattering upon the hard floor attracted everyone's immediate and undivided attention. Ina had accidentally and unfortunately spilled wine on George's regal cape, a grave and terrible disrespect towards the very symbol of the Empire. Instead of looking at all upset, the second prince looked quite mischievous instead. Yuri saw the entire thing unfold, and he felt his blood run completely cold. Without a moment's hesitation, George motioned to draw his great sword from its sheath. He then lightly placed the cold blade right against Ina's vulnerable neck. Like an executioner who was very thirsty for fresh blood, he cited that according to the strict rules of the crown, such a grave and terrible mistake is punishable only by death. Yuri was the only one who had clearly seen that. The maid had made a grave error, and the second prince now demanded her head for the sake of his so-called justice. Fortunately, the king intervened, reprimanding Prince George for disrupting the grand ball. King Fiore declared that if it was blood he craved, he should go and spill it within his own lands. George felt the immense pressure emanating from the king's words. He withdrew his blade, bowed his head, and offered a courteous apology. He respectfully spoke of the mutual respect between the kingdom and Brioel that had existed until this very moment. Then, with a masterful, cunning redirection, he invoked the name of Gatentia. Gatentia was a renowned knight of the Empire, who had been mercilessly executed by Fiore himself on Empire soil. The Emperor had respected the king's great honor, and had not demanded any sort of retribution or compensation. Prince George then likened that past event to the one happening now. He insisted that the beheading of this simple maid was a matter of protecting the honor of both nations, peace and their sacred honor. This was a treacherous situation. It was an indirect, but blatant, challenge to Fiore's very authority. With just a single sentence, George had backed the king into a tight corner with honor at stake. To stop the prince from exacting his twisted version of justice would be interpreted as a direct challenge against the entire empire. Yuri weighed all of his options, necessities and conditions, ideals and reality, reason and pure power, were all tenets far outweighed by Brioel's one central philosophy. A true Brioel must never abandon their honor. Even after death has claimed them, one must uphold that way of life. The sacred oath of Brioel stands above all else. Before Prince George could swing his deadly weapon to separate poor Ina's head from her trembling body, Yuri loudly interrupted the proceedings. He calmly walked to the center of the hall and professed his sole ownership over the terrified maid, since she was under his personal employment. Her transgressions were as good as his very own, since he too was a prince, he asked George to reconsider this severe punishment. Inwardly, Yuri could not help but feel as though he was being punished for his own criminal past. No matter what cards he had now been dealt, he was forced to play this game. He never had a choice to begin with. Instead of a merciless public execution in the middle of the grand ball, he proposed a trial by combat instead. Hearing the young boy's sincere and bold request, the second prince of a mighty empire could not contain his amused laughter. This time, Yuri's name had most definitely stuck in his mind. As the two young princes stood defiantly in front of one another, the surrounding nobles all held their collective breath. George then turned to the king and expressed his intention to accept this ridiculous but intriguing alternative. Fiore reluctantly agreed to this risky compromise, knowing that he was essentially throwing his son to the wolves. Luckily, Prince George saved some face by insisting on using a proxy for the duel. On account of their vast and significant difference in strength, he would select the youngest person from the Empire's royal guard to give the third prince a fighting chance. With that matter finally settled, the second prince saw no further reason to stay and mingle. Once the dangerous lunatic was out of the picture, Yuri swiftly ran to Ina's side to check up on her. She was still shivering violently from pure fear. She had been mere seconds away from losing her life in such a gruesome manner. After all, Yuri tried to help her to her feet, but she did not possess the strength to do so. She could not bear the heavy thought of putting her master in harm's way. In the end, she had to be escorted out by her fellow maids. Yuri then walked in the opposite direction, and just so happened to run into the princess of the empire. Yekaterina's pleasant smile was now completely gone. In its place was a very serious and heavy expression. Yuri closed his eyes and dismissed the useless thoughts from his past, and briskly walked away without uttering a single word. Hernando witnessed the entire thing happen while sipping his wine from afar. On the long way back to his room, Yuri's eldest brother was patiently waiting for him to pass by. The crown prince's usual laid-back demeanor was gone, replaced with worry and concern. He asked his younger brother about what was going to happen next. Yuri felt compelled to explain that he could not bear to witness that dickhead kill Ina like some piece of meat in a slaughterhouse. The crown prince sighed and lovingly ruffled the young boy's hair. It had been a very long while since he had felt his brother's genuine and sincere concern for his personal well-being. Before dismissing him from his presence, Cedric asked his little bro if he required any sort of assistance regarding this upcoming massive headache. Prince George had made it seem like he was being considered by assigning a proxy that was near Yuri's own level of skill. But Cedric saw this as the complete and utter opposite. If Yuri were to fight a knight that was close to his own age and strength, some sort of terrible accident could easily occur during the trial. Cedric wanted to step in and take care of the entire problem himself, using his own powerful means. However, Yuri did not want that. He had started this very problem, so he wanted to be the one to finally put an end to it. Sensing his younger brother's tangible and unwavering confidence, Cedric dropped the topic and chose to place his full trust in the boy. Right now, the grand ball was a bit of a complete mess. When the Empire's second prince had stormed off in a huff, it was now Cedric's job to fix the heavy and tense atmosphere out there. Yuri truly looked up to his amazing big brother. If the kingdom had not ultimately fallen, he was absolutely certain that Cedric would have been a great and wise ruler. In this particular lifetime, he wanted to see what kind of kingdom Brielle was capable of becoming under the benevolent reign of Cedric. For that to happen, the boy must fight his way through and ensure that such a future exists. It did not take George very long to select the youngest knight in his order. Today, some red-headed, hotshot prodigy of the Empire has taken to the stage to go up against the third prince, while everybody else watches from the relative comfort of their seats, judging by his very excited smile. Hernando did not look too worried about this upcoming tryst at all. As for Captain Sand, he has seen enough geniuses to tell that the opponent's energy was extremely stable and controlled, based on his very refined movements. The knight looked like a true blade expert as well. This dude was the product of the Empire's intense military education. After all, while Captain Sand was stressing out over Yuri's personal safety, the court mage was just smiling and chuckling beside, looking at the main stage. The third prince was just stretching out his arms while casually yawning, as though this upcoming fight was the most boring thing in the entire world. By Hernando's own personal estimation, there was nothing to worry about at all. In this particular world, The rank of Grand Wizard is one that is virtually impossible to ever reach. Of the various ranks that are given to mages in the different magic towers, the title is only ever given to mages who have obtained what is called origin magic. Among these all-powerful origin magic spells exists the ultimate power to take a brief peek at the world's very own fate, the all-seeing, fate-revealing magic. In this wide world, there is only a single mage who has ever succeeded in learning that truly overpowered ability. Hernando, he remembers going up against the third prince when they were both in their degenerate, reckless gambler phase. It was the very first time that he had ever lost any money, ever since he had obtained his own powerful origin magic. At first, he tried to chalk it all up to a simple coincidence. Maybe it was just a case of some bad luck on his part, but that was truly impossible. His fate-revealing magic allowed him to read an opponent's hidden hand and the very flow of fortune with just a mere single glance. But he could not read anything at all about the young brat's future. When he tried hard enough to do so, he could only see the illusion of a great, misty sword mountain in the middle of those swirling mists. He could make out a young boy with raven black hair and eyes that were shaped into an incredibly arrogant and defiant gaze, unmistakably belonging to the very same third prince. Hernando watched as the young man plowed through entire hordes of enemies. Despite his own bloodied and heavily battered body, he swung his mighty sword and never yielded for a single second. The strange and powerful vision had ended, with the young knight collapsing in a state of utter, bleak despair. Back then, Hernando had dismissed the entire story as just a weird quirk in his ability, a simple coincidence, if you will. From that very point on, he became aware of a great anomaly in the very order of the universe. Hernando was right beside the young prince the entire time. He had witnessed the kid's erratic actions and all of his drastic changes. Hernando was once convinced that his fate-revealing magic could easily peel through that seemingly unbreakable and solid wall. But now, it all made perfect sense. He was quite certain that Prince Yuri was a man with no destiny at all. Right now, that very same kid with no discernible future was about to showcase his incredible skills in front of everyone in the arena. His opponent had been practicing and swinging his impressive sword on the other side of the grand stage, driving the third prince mad with sheer and utter impatience. Second Prince George asked the participants if they were now ready, and both of the combatants gave their go-ahead for the start of the match. Under the intense, close scrutiny of the king, the trial by combat had officially commenced. In the first few tense seconds, both the prince and the knight maintained their respective distances, while watching out for any sudden, quick movements. As soon as the go signal was finally dropped, Yuri shot forward at truly breakneck speeds, much to the other knight's complete and utter surprise. He envisioned himself getting caught by the very first attack, so badly that a quarter of his upper body was wiped from existence. Like a true, tried, and battle-tested fighter, the knight powered through the initial surprise and raised his own sword for a sturdy defense. They exchanged rapid blows, mere milliseconds apart from each other, while hopping nimbly all over the entire place. Yuri's powerful blade attacked and then defended, depending on whether he needed a strong defense or sheer lethality. As the fight continued on, it became harder to suppress his amused smile. Right now, the opponent who had been trying to catch him off guard had a long, bloody blade wound on his very cheek. In the crowd, Fiore turned to his court mage with a question. With the heavy concern of a father, he asked Hernando about the possible outcome of this deadly blade dance. In all honesty, the all-seeing mage could not see the end result at all. Instead of feeling all upset, he felt quite thrilled. Instead, the king recalled that when the young magician had first arrived in Bryall, he had stated that it was through heaven's divine guidance that he landed here. When the king asked if the time for his departure had finally arrived, Hernando decisively and firmly answered no. Fiore sighed in pure, utter relief. It was a very good thing that such a valuable asset was staying by his side. Hernando humbly responded, and the king then warned him that excessive and undue modesty could bring about great misfortune. Asking the king to turn his attention back to the raging fight, he asked the strongest swordsman in the entire world about his own perspective on who the stronger swordsman was between the two combatants on the stage. Without a single shadow of a doubt, King Fiore gave the esteemed title to the empire's prodigious young knight. Logically and realistically speaking, the king was absolutely right in saying that. Hernando was finally beginning to understand why. The heavenly signs had pointed him towards this specific kingdom. The heavens were trying to get him, in the close vicinity of a man who could shift the very fate of the entire world. At first, he had thought he was being drawn towards the strongest swordsman, the king himself. In all honesty, the long years of peace had led him to believe that it was now time to pack up, to go, and to never once look back. But with that interesting young man, budding into quite an interesting and unique specimen, Hernando could not possibly go away and miss out on all the action. When the young knight tried to bum rush him in a desperate move, Yuri increased the intensity of his mana, coating his powerful ancestral blade. He was done testing the waters and just dipping his toes in. It was now time to get some real attacks going to finally end this ridiculous farce. The young knight could clearly feel and see the sudden, sharp increase in the prince's incredible speed, like a torrent of flowing water. The sharp glint of the blade danced around before reaching the killing range, through the enemy's very neck as the mana got close enough to burn his skin, and the cold, hard steel of the blade inched ever closer. The young knight closed his eyes and accepted his own impending and certain doom. The ones who were most taken aback by this were the royals who were in the Empire's own viewing deck. At his own incredible level, Fiore had managed to follow the entire series of attacks down to the last-minute detail. Even Captain Sand was completely slack-jawed at the sudden reversal on the stage. As for Hernando, he smiled wryly at the final choice that the kid had just made. He had actually twisted his powerful sword at the last possible second, just a few mere inches away from a clean and swift behead. He had deliberately and purposefully stopped the powerful onslaught of his blade. When the young knight finally voiced out his own clear surrender, loud cheers for the prince erupted from all of the viewing decks. Hernando had been roaming the vast lands, chasing after heavenly signs. Who would have ever thought that he would meet someone who could defy his own guiding divine light? Life had turned into death, and death had turned into new life. The humble, lowly mage's destiny had finally and irrevocably changed, and so had the boy's. Every single step of his now defied the very will of the cosmos. Yuri Bryal was the only life form that was now free from the binding bounds of a set destiny. Hernando could not wait to see how this kid would make massive waves all over the entire world, wondering how this transcender of fate would now reshape the very destiny of the whole world. It filled the mage with a sense of thrilling and profound anticipation. Just like that, 5 long and peaceful years passed by in the land of the Bryals. Today, a new, young maid was zooming through the vast castle halls, filled with pure anxiety. It was her very first day at this new and important job, and she had already mixed up her officially assigned area. Just as she was hoping to get into her correct position without anyone noticing, a strong voice stopped her dead in her tracks. He had a very deep and commanding voice, a dark and brooding look in his eyes, and black hair that symbolized Bryal's fierce loyalty. The man interrogated her about her seemingly very suspicious, roaming around through the empty, cavernous halls. The newbie tried her very hardest to calm herself down and to remember what her various seniors had taught her. The man continued to glare down at her, and he did not wear a stoic or imposing expression, so he was definitely not the king. The crown prince, on the other hand, always greeted other people with a very gentle smile. This one had very sinister eyes and walked with crooked steps. He had to be one of the 2 remaining princes, afraid of possibly offending one of the bosses. On her very first day, the newbie tried to pardon and excuse herself. The man then yelled at her even louder for ignoring his royal and divine presence. He asked if these maids all had some sort of special manual, mentioning that he himself must be avoided at all costs. Running out of all of his patience, the prince finally decided to dish out some very heavy and important education on the new girl. Before that could proceed any further, however, a very laid-back voice called out to his dear brother to stop his rather creepy and unsettling behavior. When the newbie was just training to one day enter the castle, everyone had told her to take special note of one more person in that stronghold. If she ever saw someone wearing a very confident and self-assured expression while carrying a long sword at his waist, she must then greet the handsome 3rd prince with the utmost and sincere respect. After forcefully separating his own brother from that poor, terrified maid, Yuri went for a long stroll around the courtyard with a bag of delicious snacks in his hand. As a form of payment for getting her out of some serious trouble, the maid had kindly handed him a decadent and large bag of various sweets. It was quite delicious indeed. After wiping his mouth and dusting off his hands, Yuri then focused. He was now at the unarmed realm level, a state where the immense pressure on his hand and his body was now lessened, with or without the use of sword. Reaching that very high level after years of hard work was quite a significant achievement. It had now been half a decade since he was killed by Lauren's undead and cursed sword, and had regressed all the way back to his 13-year-old body. Now that he was 18 years old, the peaceful days would soon be coming to an end. Speaking of which, those old men in charge of the kingdom's entire future were probably yapping their asses off at this very moment. Yuri then headed for the main conference room. He knocked and yelled for anyone to let him in, but to no avail. Inside, the sounds of intense and heated arguing leaked out through the door. The guard who was standing by the large entrance suggested that the third prince should try knocking on the door one more time, and maybe someone would eventually hear and let him in. Done with wasting his time and being completely ignored, Yuri used his newfound mana enhancement to completely blow the door wide open with his powerful fist. The high-ranking nobles of the kingdom were both scared and utterly confused to see the third prince apologizing for his very rude intrusion. He had been knocking for over a minute, but no one had seemed to hear. Like a very reasonable guy, he had just used more force. The second time around, Yuri then turned to his own father, who was at the head of the long table, and requested to be included in this very important conference. After he had been seated, the heated discussion about the last and biggest agenda item continued. One of the younger counts then restarted the important dialogue by asserting that they did not have any spare troops available to help their allies who were stationed outside of the kingdom's border. If the nobles were going to ignore the empire's very earnest request, then the nobles themselves should be the ones to shoulder the responsibility. Instead, Yuri understood why everyone felt so very strongly about their stance on this particular issue. Everyone was heavily considering their own personal gains and losses. It was all a high-stakes money game. If he recalled correctly, this particular coalition of allied forces and the grim, tragic incident it would eventually suffer was about to begin. The Empire had issued a call for every neighboring power to join the so-called allied forces. They had humbly requested troops from many various nations in the hopes of building a large army, one that was big enough for a massive ORC raid towards the east. Yuri knew that this entire operation would end in complete and utter failure. In their unbridled fury, the orcs would rampage through the entire human army, putting immense and heavy pressure on all of the bordering nations. The truly odd thing was that the orcs seemingly ignored the Empire. That was when everybody finally realized that the letter, the failed raid, and everything that had happened after that had been perfectly and masterfully orchestrated right from the very start. In the process, Brial had lost many outstanding knights and brave heroes, including the great Sir Leon Flandra, with Yuri now present in the very room where it happens. He would not let things go south in this current lifetime. The table was pretty much evenly split on the final decision to send or not to send troops to the new allied forces before the endless bitching and moaning about protecting their own numbers could possibly get any worse. Yuri decisively volunteered to be sent to the front lines himself. He would personally join the allied forces so that they could properly show their sincerity to the entire world. As for these politicking and cowardly old men, all he asked was for them to finally do their own noble duty and not bring the Brial name any more unnecessary shame. Hearing his own son speak with such candor and unwavering honor made the king smirk just a little bit. He was quite impressed that his boy had arrived with a perfect answer that would successfully tick off all of the required boxes. Later that very same day, Yuri transferred over to his beloved training grounds to spar with Bernard. One of his many brothers, the particularly rude one, came running into the large arena to ask him if the news was true that Lil Bro was seriously heading off to the dangerous front lines. The arrogant and completely ignorant brute could not at all understand why Yuri was now risking his own safety when he was an untouchable and powerful royalty within the very kingdom. Yuri then retorted, Though what he was trying to do was precisely the solemn duty of a true royal. With a heavy sigh, the second prince asserted that he finally understood his lil bro's complex mindset. With a new twinkle in his eyes and a new appreciation for his own life, he promised to faithfully protect the palace while Yuri was far away. Then the dumbass ran away with his very unnatural and odd gift. At this point, Yuri would be relieved if that complete fool did not cause any more trouble, let alone manage to protect their beloved home. On the topic of him now leaving home, the third prince asked his longtime friend and personal instructor, Bernard, if he was worried at all about his own personal safety. The great sword demon reckoned that, as long as the kid did not do anything too overly reckless, he would surely return to them in one single piece. Knowing how very critical the old man usually was, this was quite a generous and kind evaluation of him. Still, he urged the third prince to always be vigilant and extremely careful. In his fabled sword demon days, Bernard had learned how very tricky dealing with orcs truly was. Those big, ugly fuckers were stronger and far more despicable than you would ever expect them to be. He warned the kid to look out for the orcs, who carried a tattered, worn-out flag on their very backs. Those things were from the world of the Warcraft. They were the dreaded Orc Falls, a particularly ferocious and incredibly powerful subset of these beasts. Yuri assured his concerned trainer that everything would be completely fine. He had his own ways of dealing with them. After all, interrupting their important and private conversation, Aina barged into the grand training hall while trying desperately to catch her own breath. She came by to inform her young master that Yuri's guest had finally arrived with that very special thing that he had ordered. He had a plan for this upcoming and surely doomed ORC raid, a very special and intricate one at that. The guest that Aina had pinged him about was sitting in Yuri's office while drinking some fine tea. When the third prince finally entered the room, the Elaine Merchant Guild's vice president, Guillermo, quickly stood up and extended a very reverent and formal greeting. Yuri had thought he would be meeting with Elaine herself today, but his madam was currently out on the road. So the vice president had to shoehorn himself in as a temporary substitute. Even with the immense success of their merchant guild over the past 5 years, she still preferred to go on very dangerous product runs all by herself. She says it is what she does the very best. Well, Guillermo did not come here completely empty-handed. He had procured and delivered Yuri's very special item. The third prince excitedly opened the very ornate and beautiful box. And finally, the 4-piece dagger set, Elementarian, was now in his very possession. Guillermo had gone through a lot of very difficult hoops to get this set, and he had not expected such an exorbitant and high price for some merely decorative and fancy daggers. But these powerful things were not purely for decorative purposes. They were powerful artifacts that were imbued with great and ancient magic. Seeing the third prince's powerful mana manipulation now in action, Guillermo almost shat his very pants. To tease the man even further, Yuri slowly brought the very tip of the blade to the man's frightened face. Pause. When the sharp blade was finally withdrawn, Guillermo breathed a very heavy sigh of complete relief. The prince's masterful mana use was simply on another, higher level. Suddenly, a dark and shadowy figure entered the very same room. It was incredibly quick and completely silent. Yuri caught a brief glimpse in the corner of his eye, but Guillermo was none the wiser to its presence. The arrival of that strange shadow prompted Yuri to send the businessman away. In a few short days, he wanted an exhaustive and detailed report about how the mighty empire was now preparing for the upcoming raid. When Guillermo was finally out of the entire picture, Yuri slumped onto the comfortable couch and called for someone to come out of the shadows. Slowly and quietly, Asuna materialized directly behind him, now clad in her practical assassin's garb. First and foremost, he wanted to know if their little Goryo problem had been properly handled, as the boss had ordered. Asuna had sent that vile loan shark a very convincing and clear warning. She had left a strongly worded message for that bastard to stay in his own lane. In the middle of the dark night, Yuri had to personally step in, since that greedy cash rat kept on trying to go after Elaine's hard-earned money. On the way to this very room, Asuna had heard the various servants talking about this powerful boss of hers joining the Union Army. With a great deal of concern, she urged him to be extremely careful out there. She made it sound like he was going out into enemy territory all alone. Well, that was not the case, since Asuna would be tagging along with him in this upcoming perilous journey. When asked if she could possibly keep up, Asana's deadpan and serious expression curved into a very beautiful and warm smile. Anywhere was better than where she had originally come from. She would be by her new master's side, even in the midst of a terrible war. A few days later, the day of the Great March had finally and truly arrived. Before leaving, Crown Prince Cedric sought out his younger little brother. While he was busy fixing his new, shining black armor, with a great and deep concern, all he asked of Yuri was to take good care of himself out there on the battlefield. The third prince confidently jested that he was completely invincible. Out on the bloody front lines, he planned to raise the glorious image of Brial. He then returned the concern for his big bro's very own eyes that have been worsening since he has been deep into his various books every day. Before they finally parted, Cedric hugged his little brother very tightly, hoping that it would not be long before they saw each other once again. Yuri promised him that he would be back very soon. The war trumpets blared loudly, calling for every single soldier's attention. Up on the grand platform, King Fiore stood proudly in front of all his countrymen to signal the great ceremony's solemn commencement. The commander of the now departing army climbed up the red-carpeted stairs. With the utmost and unwavering confidence, the third prince of the mighty kingdom, clad in his shiny and imposing new armor, looked truly awe-inspiring. Speaking now as a father, Fiore asked his son if he was feeling at all nervous. He then asked the young man to turn all the way around and to look at the very men that he would be leading. In this upcoming military campaign, all the Brial soldiers lined up in the town square were valuable and precious lives that he must now carry on his own shoulders. Realistically speaking, not every single person in this vast army would be able to come back alive. However, Yuri was completely determined to make sure that they would not face a pitiful and tragic death like in his dark and terrible past life. For one final and last time, the king then asked his own son if he was truly ready to shoulder such a massive and heavy responsibility. Before he could even answer, King Fiore had already left the grand podium. As the very atmosphere in the large town square turned unbearably hostile, Yuri looked at the man who was now in front of him and felt such a thick and vicious and overwhelming murderous intent. His entire body trembled, refusing to move an inch from where he was currently standing. He instinctively felt that the thing that was now approaching him wanted his very blood. It was the very personification of death itself. As the dark and shadowy avatar raised its deadly blade, Yuri could tell that trying to evade its attack would result in a very painful death. Fortunately, the third prince had never once slacked when it came to properly training his body and mind for such perilous situations. Using the ancestors' own powerful mana method, he stimulated his core to combat the crippling and paralyzing hold of sheer terror. He carefully and expertly drew his blade and entered a very steady defensive stance. Instead of simply waiting and letting the powerful strike set the tempo, he used the soul-severing slash to meet the blade of death itself. Up on the platform, the father and son crossed their mighty swords to a firm standstill. With a very satisfied and proud smile, King Fiore praised his boy for a job well done. That single sword strike would now serve as Yuri's own letter of official departure. King Fiore was not the type to hold ceremonies for any longer than they should be. All he asked was for his own son to come back to him alive. Like a truly seasoned veteran of war, Yuri Briol turned his full attention to the men that he would soon be leading, to the very depths of hell itself. He raised his mighty sword, and his soldiers started to passionately chant his very own name. With the utmost and complete conviction, he asked his soldiers to place their unwavering trust and absolute faith in him. The great banner was raised, and all blades were now drawn. It was now time for the brave soldiers of Briol to march up towards the border. Word of Yuri's sudden departure had reached the very ears of a certain someone. Down in the dark dungeon, orcs were being kept captive for various research purposes. Count Seymour, the kingdom's truly valiant and courageous first line of defense,